Imagine standing on the cold shores of the Atlantic Ocean sometime in the early 17th century. The sky is gray, the wind carries the smell of salt, and wooden ships creak as waves crash against their hulls. These ships are not simply carrying sailors and supplies. They are carrying something far more powerful, an idea. An idea that a small island nation, sitting quietly off the coast of Europe, could stretch its power across the oceans and reshape the destiny of continents it had never seen before. At that moment in history, few people could have imagined what was about to unfold. Britain was not yet the dominant global empire that historians speak about today. It was simply one of several European powers competing for influence, wealth, and territory. Yet within a few centuries, the British Empire would grow into the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its peak, it controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruled over hundreds of millions of people spread across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. But how did this happen? How did a relatively small island manage to build an empire so vast that people would later say, almost poetically, that the sun never set on it? To understand this, we must travel back to a time when the world was still being mapped by explorers, when oceans were both highways and mysteries, and when ambition, trade, and survival pushed nations into competition across the globe. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, Europe was experiencing what historians now call the Age of Exploration. Countries like Spain and Portugal had already begun establishing colonies in the Americas and trading posts across Asia. Their ships returned home carrying gold, silver, spices, and other resources that transformed their economies. Britain watched carefully. Merchants, sailors, and investors realized that enormous wealth could be created through global trade. However, long-distance trade required something more than ships. It required networks, ports, alliances, military protection, and administrative systems capable of managing distant territories. This realization led to the creation of one of the most influential institutions in imperial history, the East India Company. Founded in 1600 under a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, the East India Company was originally just a trading company. Its purpose was simple: to trade with Asia, particularly the rich markets of India and the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. Yet what began as a commercial venture slowly transformed into something much more powerful. Company ships sailed thousands of miles to reach Asian ports. They carried textiles, silver, and manufactured goods. In return, they brought back spices, silk, tea, and cotton. These goods were incredibly valuable in Europe, and demand continued to grow. But trade alone was not enough. In distant lands, trade routes could be disrupted by pirates, rival European powers, or local political conflicts. To protect their investments, the company began building fortified trading posts. These were not full colonies at first, just secure locations where merchants could store goods and conduct business. Yet each fortified post required soldiers, administrators, and infrastructure. Over time, these trading stations slowly expanded into centers of influence. In India, for example, places like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta began as modest trading settlements. But as political situations changed within the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company found opportunities to increase its power. Local rulers sometimes sought British support against rival kingdoms. In exchange, they offered trade privileges or territorial control. This pattern repeated itself again and again. Trade created presence. Presence created influence. Influence eventually created control. One of the most dramatic turning points occurred in 1757 during the Battle of Plassey. In this battle, forces of the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal, largely through strategic alliances and military organization. The victory gave the company control over Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world at the time. Bengal was famous for its textile industry and fertile agricultural lands. Control of this region provided enormous wealth and strengthened Britain's global position. But India was only one piece of a much larger story. Across the Atlantic Ocean, British colonies were expanding in North America and the Caribbean. Sugar plantations in islands such as Jamaica and Barbados became major sources of wealth. These plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor brought from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. This trade formed a triangular economic system. Ships from Britain carried manufactured goods to Africa. From Africa, enslaved people were transported to the Americas. From the Americas, ships returned to Europe carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other valuable products. The profits from this system helped finance Britain's growing naval power and overseas expansion. Meanwhile, Britain's navy became one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Control of the seas meant control of trade routes. And control of trade routes meant economic power. By the 18th century, British ships were sailing across nearly every major ocean. They connected ports in India, Africa, the Caribbean, and North America into a single global network. Yet behind these large historical movements were countless individual human stories. Imagine a young sailor leaving the port of London for the first time. He may have been only 17 years old, standing nervously on the deck as the ship slowly drifted away from the dock. He had no idea when or if he would return home. His journey might take him to India, Africa, or the Caribbean. Along the way he would face storms, disease, and months of isolation at sea. For many sailors, the ocean itself was as mysterious as the lands they were sailing toward. Similarly, merchants invested their fortunes in these voyages. A single successful journey could make someone wealthy beyond imagination. But a storm, a pirate attack, or a failed trade negotiation could wipe out everything. These risks were part of the system that drove imperial expansion. Meanwhile, people living in regions where the British arrived experienced enormous changes. In some places, new trade opportunities created wealth and urban growth. In others, local economies were reshaped to serve the needs of imperial markets. Agriculture shifted toward export crops. Political power shifted toward leaders who cooperated with imperial authorities. And slowly, across continents, British influence expanded. By the early 19th century, the British Empire had become the world's largest political and economic network. Its power was not based on a single factor. Instead, it relied on a combination of trade, military strength, diplomacy, and administration. Ships carried goods across oceans. Telegraph lines later carried information across continents. Colonial administrators governed territories thousands of miles from London. It was a system that connected distant parts of the world in ways never seen before. Yet beneath this global network lay deep tensions. Expansion brought wealth to Britain, but it also brought resistance in many regions. Local populations did not always accept foreign rule. Cultural differences, economic exploitation, and political control created conflicts that would later shape the decline of the empire. And this raises an important question. Was the British Empire primarily a story of opportunity and global connection? Or was it a story of domination, exploitation, and resistance? The answer, as history often reveals, is far more complicated than a simple explanation. Because the same empire that built railways, legal systems, and trade networks also reshaped societies, economies, and cultures in ways that are still visible today. Borders, languages, institutions, and global trade routes all carry traces of that imperial past. And as we move further into this story, the focus begins to shift toward another continent. One that would soon become a major stage for imperial competition. Africa. A land rich in resources, cultures, and history. A land that European powers would increasingly view as both an opportunity and a strategic prize. But the expansion into Africa would not simply be about maps and treaties. It would involve explorers, soldiers, traders, missionaries, and millions of local people whose lives would be deeply affected by imperial ambitions. And as the 19th century progressed, the race to control Africa would accelerate, transforming both the continent itself and the empire that sought to dominate it. The morning sun barely pierced through the dense canopy of West Africa as the first British ships crested the horizon. The riverbanks were alive with the chatter of traders, the calls of fishermen, and the rhythmic pounding of drums that had marked the life of these communities for centuries. It was here, amid the richness of the African coastline and the vast inland forests, that the British Empire sought to carve a foothold. The story of Africa's encounter with empire was neither simple nor inevitable. It was a collision of cultures, ambitions, and human lives in a place of profound natural wealth. By the early 19th century, the British had already established a series of coastal forts and trading posts along the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. These structures were more than simple buildings, they were instruments of control. Behind the stone walls, ledgers recorded every sack of cocoa, every barrel of palm oil, every ounce of gold that flowed from the interior to the Atlantic. Here, commerce was inseparable from power. A merchant's ledger, a soldier's watchtower, a governor's residence, all were nodes in a network designed to project influence deep into African societies. But the human consequences were immediate. Local leaders were compelled to navigate new hierarchies, sometimes co-opted, sometimes coerced. Families found their livelihoods intertwined with a system that prioritized profit over tradition. The trade routes themselves tell a story of both ingenuity and exploitation. Rivers like the Niger and the Volta became highways, carrying goods, people, and ideas. Canoes laden with kola nuts, ivory, and hides traveled alongside the new steamships the British introduced. These ships symbolized the empire's technological advantage, and they moved not just goods, but also the very framework of British authority. Naval power became the backbone of colonial expansion. The Royal Navy patrolled African waters with an efficiency that local communities had never witnessed, deterring rival European powers, suppressing resistance, and ensuring that trade flowed according to British dictates. It was a silent, omnipresent force, felt in every port, every market, every river crossing. Yet behind the statistics and strategy were the human stories. Take Kwame, a cocoa farmer in the Gold Coast whose ancestors had tilled the same land for generations. By the 1880s, Kwame's small farm was linked directly to Liverpool, London, and beyond. The demand for cocoa transformed his days. No longer was the work dictated solely by the rhythms of the seasons. Instead, it followed the cycles of global markets. Prices fluctuated with the whims of traders thousands of miles away. Kwame's story is echoed across Africa. Labor reorganized, economies transformed, lives reshaped. The empire brought infrastructure, roads, ports, telegraphs, but every innovation was entwined with control. A telegraph pole stretching inland was not merely a tool for communication. It was a line of empire, connecting the African interior to the distant halls of London. Resistance was never absent. In the hinterlands of Nigeria, leaders such as the Emirates of Sokoto and the Yoruba kingdoms wrestled with British incursion. Treaties were signed under duress, and military campaigns followed whenever compliance faltered. The British relied heavily on superior firepower, disciplined troops, and alliances with local rulers to establish dominance. But each campaign left traces, burned villages, disrupted societies, and a legacy of mistrust that would persist long after colonial officers departed. These moments of confrontation reveal an essential truth. Empire was not simply imposed from afar. It was contested at every turn by those whose lives were being transformed. The expansion into East Africa tells a parallel story. Zanzibar became a critical hub for the trade in cloves and ivory. Here, the British combined diplomacy, trade, and military presence to assert authority. It was in Zanzibar that one could witness the complex interplay between global commerce and human experience. Merchants navigated both European legal codes and local customs. Slaves and freed workers alike contributed to the economy, and the port became a place of constant negotiation between cultures, interests, and ambitions. Naval vessels anchored offshore were both a promise and a warning. The empire could protect trade and, when necessary, enforce it. The science of logistics underpinned this expansion. Supply lines were calculated with precision. Steamships reduced transit times, while new maps and surveys allowed officers to plan routes into previously uncharted territories. Colonial administrators meticulously tracked resources, populations, and economic output. This data, often hidden in dusty archives, reflects the empire's obsession with efficiency and control. Every map marked not only rivers and mountains but also the locations of potential resistance and the best paths for trade caravans. It was a geography of power as much as it was of land. And yet, mystery and curiosity persisted. African societies, with their rich oral histories, intricate social systems, and spiritual landscapes, often confounded British officials. Explorers, surveyors, and traders were constantly learning, adapting, sometimes failing in their attempts to impose order. There was awe as well as exploitation. European audiences marveled at reports of vast forests, exotic animals, and powerful kingdoms. But these accounts, filtered through imperial priorities, rarely captured the nuanced realities of daily life for the people of Africa. Stories of individuals illuminate these complexities. A young sailor, far from home, navigating the waters off the Gold Coast, might have marveled at the sunset over the Atlantic even as he carried goods destined for European markets. An African trader, negotiating taxes and tolls with a British officer, balanced survival and opportunity. A local family, displaced by the expansion of a cocoa plantation, confronted the upheaval of generations. These human stories provide texture to the broader sweep of history, reminding us that empire was experienced in the intimate rhythms of daily life as much as in grand political maneuvers. The empire's naval power, particularly, became a source of both order and fear. British ships patrolled the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, securing trade routes against piracy, rival powers, and resistance movements. Ports were fortified, coasts mapped, and communications synchronized with London. This global maritime network allowed the empire to operate across continents, projecting authority far beyond its physical presence. And yet, this same network created interdependencies. African goods fueled European industries, European currency penetrated local economies, and naval strength dictated the tempo of commerce and colonization alike. As the 19th century progressed, the British expanded further inland, constructing railways to connect ports to the hinterlands. These railways transformed Africa's landscape. Tracks cut through forests, over rivers, and across savannas, linking resources to markets. But the human cost was significant. Laborers endured grueling conditions, often coerced or underpaid, while local communities adapted to the presence of foreign authority on their land. For many, the railway symbolized both progress and subjugation, a path toward modernity paved with sacrifice. Trade was not only a material process but a cultural exchange. Goods, ideas, languages, and technologies moved along the same routes. European merchants introduced new crops, tools, and practices. African societies contributed their knowledge, labor, and products. The empire thrived on these interactions, often exploiting them, but they also created spaces of mutual influence. For instance, the adoption of English legal practices or currency systems facilitated commerce but also reshaped social structures and governance. And yet, Africa retained its mysteries. From the dense forests of the Congo to the deserts of the north, explorers and administrators continually discovered landscapes, societies, and wildlife that defied expectation. These mysteries fueled curiosity back in Britain, inspiring maps, books, lectures, and debates. At the same time, the empire's gaze transformed those same landscapes, leaving physical, economic, and cultural imprints that would persist for generations. By the late 19th century, Africa was no longer a distant, mysterious continent. It had become a central stage in the drama of global imperialism. The British Empire's presence reshaped cities, trade networks, and societies. Ports thrived with the movement of palm oil, cocoa, ivory, and other resources. Military outposts dotted the landscape, securing not only commerce but the structures of authority. And throughout all this, human lives, the workers, the sailors, the traders, the families, were both actors and witnesses, navigating the transformations imposed by a global power. The expansion into Africa illustrates a key principle of imperial growth. Power is never abstract. It is exercised through trade, through infrastructure, through naval dominance, and through the everyday negotiations and struggles of human beings. Each ship that sailed, each port that grew, each ledger that recorded transactions, represents both an economic calculation and a human story. It is in these stories that the complex reality of empire comes alive, a reality neither wholly heroic nor entirely villainous, but endlessly human in its ambition, exploitation, and adaptation. The sun rose over the lush plains of India, casting long shadows across rice paddies, tea plantations, and bustling market streets. In the air, the scent of spices mingled with smoke from early morning cooking fires. The subcontinent, with its intricate tapestries of kingdoms, cultures, and communities, became one of the crown jewels of the British Empire. To the outside world, India was a land of unimaginable wealth, producing textiles, spices, tea, and other commodities that had captured European imagination for centuries. Yet, beneath the grandeur of colonial administration and the rhythms of trade, there existed countless human stories of adaptation, negotiation, resistance, and survival. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company had established itself not merely as a trading entity but as a political power. Forts, warehouses, and administrative centers dotted the coastline from Calcutta to Bombay, while its armies penetrated inland, forging alliances with local rulers, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through coercion. Trade was both the engine and the justification of empire. Cotton and silk, indigo and opium, flowed from India to the markets of Europe, generating immense profits for a distant island kingdom. Ports like Madras and Calcutta became hubs of commerce, their docks alive with sailors, merchants, laborers, and artisans, each contributing to the complex machinery of colonial enterprise. Amid these networks, human experience was rich and varied. Take Asha, a young girl growing up near the Hooghly River. Her family labored in the rice fields, their routines influenced by seasonal cycles that had endured for generations. Yet by the 19th century, global markets dictated the price of rice, and colonial officials imposed taxes that tied her family's livelihood to policies made thousands of miles away. Asha's story was one of millions, reflecting the intimate ways in which empire reshaped daily life, where harvests were measured not only in grains but in the shifting currents of global commerce. Malaya, another vital jewel, presented a different challenge. Rich in tin and rubber, it became essential for the industrial machinery of Britain. The arrival of colonial officials and labor recruiters brought profound changes. Communities once organized around local authority were now integrated into international supply chains. Workers from India, China, and local Malay populations labored side by side in plantations and mines. Their lives, often harsh and regulated by colonial mandates, contributed directly to a distant industrial economy they could scarcely see or touch. It was in these places, amid the jungles and tin mines, that the human cost of global expansion became starkly visible. Naval power, as in Africa, remained the silent backbone of imperial authority. British ships patrolled the Indian Ocean, safeguarding trade routes, projecting authority, and deterring rivals. The seas became highways of both commerce and control. Pirates, local insurgents, and competing European powers were kept at bay not only by superior firepower but also by the intricate knowledge of currents, tides, and coastal geography. These same vessels carried stories of sailors witnessing new lands, of goods transported across oceans, of messages and intelligence flowing to administrators waiting in distant offices in London. Yet resistance never ceased. In Bengal, local uprisings erupted against taxation and monopolies imposed by the East India Company. In Malaya, guerrilla fighters challenged the extraction of resources, the displacement of communities, and the social hierarchies enforced by the colonial administration. Resistance was both violent and subtle. Strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, and the preservation of cultural practices in the face of assimilation pressures. These acts remind us that the empire, for all its military might and economic reach, was constantly negotiating with the people whose lands and lives it claimed to govern. Science and technology amplified the empire's reach. Telegraph lines linked administrative centers, railways carried goods and troops across difficult terrain, and survey maps transformed unknown landscapes into grids of control. In India, the railways connected ports to inland cities, facilitating the movement of cotton, tea, and opium. Surveys measured not only distances but resources, populations, and potential points of resistance. Every line drawn on a map, every rail laid, every telegraph pole erected, reinforced the network that allowed a small island nation to govern a continent. Human stories intersected with these structures of power. A railway worker, far from his home village, might spend months laying tracks through dense forests, battling disease and exhaustion. A tea picker in Assam would labor under the gaze of supervisors, harvesting leaves that would find their way into teacups across Europe. Traders in Calcutta navigated complex regulations, balancing profit and survival. Through their lives, the mechanisms of empire became tangible, not abstract. They reveal how economic networks, technology, and administration affected real lives in profound ways. Curiosity and mystery accompanied expansion. British officials often marveled at India's diversity, its languages, religions, and traditions. Explorers and surveyors documented flora, fauna, and cultural practices with both scientific rigor and fascination. Yet these accounts, often filtered through colonial perspectives, captured only fragments of life. Indigenous knowledge, local innovation, and cultural resilience persisted, even flourished, alongside the imposition of foreign rule. The empire's gaze could record, map, and categorize, but it could not fully comprehend the depth of human experience in these lands. Trade in Asia was a web of interconnections. Spices from the Malabar coast, silk from Gujarat, tin from Malaya, and tea from Assam moved along both sea lanes and riverine highways. Ports became centers of cultural exchange as well as economic hubs. Merchants, sailors, and administrators navigated these networks, adapting to local conditions while enforcing imperial directives. The human element, negotiation, adaptation, creativity, was inseparable from commerce. And yet, despite the vast reach of the British Empire, mysteries endured. The jungles of Malaya, the mountains of India, and the islands of the Bay of Bengal challenged administrators and explorers alike. Disease, geography, and local resistance ensured that expansion was never smooth or complete. It was a push and pull, a dialogue between imperial ambition and the lived reality of the people and landscapes it sought to control. Through it all, the empire's presence transformed societies. Cities grew, trade flourished, and infrastructures of power extended across continents. But the costs were equally real. Displacement, labor exploitation, cultural assimilation, and resistance met with repression. Human stories, of endurance, adaptation, and sometimes tragedy, underscore the complex dynamics of expansion. They remind us that empire was not just a story of power, but also of the people who lived, worked, and struggled under its shadow. By the early 20th century, Asia had become a mosaic of colonial influence and local resilience. India, Malaya, and other territories produced wealth, culture, and knowledge that reverberated globally. The empire's trade networks connected continents, while naval power ensured security and mobility. But beneath the statistics of economic growth lay millions of human experiences. Families adjusting to new taxes, communities responding to new laws, workers navigating plantations and ports, and resistance movements asserting agency in subtle and overt ways. Asia's expansion shows how empire functioned as a complex system: economic, administrative, military, and social. Each element, trade, naval power, infrastructure, governance, was intertwined with human lives, local traditions, and resistance. Stories of individuals and communities illuminate the broader history, transforming abstract statistics into vivid, lived experiences. They allow us to see empire not only as a machine of extraction but also as a stage on which human resilience, adaptation, and ingenuity unfolded. The narratives of Asia reveal the full scope of imperial ambition. Strategic ports, trade networks, railways, and telegraphs enabled Britain to govern lands far from its shores. Naval power protected these networks and projected authority across oceans. Yet human agency, through labor, commerce, adaptation, and resistance, shaped the empire as much as imperial policies. Each story, each act of negotiation or defiance, left traces that continue to inform the cultural, economic, and social landscapes of Asia today. Expansion in Asia was a story of contrasts: wealth and hardship, control and resistance, technological marvels and human cost. By tracing these stories, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of empire but also into the lives of those who lived through it, their struggles, ingenuity, and resilience. The empire was vast, but it was always made up of millions of human stories, each interacting with the larger machinery of global power. And as the sun set over the Malayan jungle or along the rivers of Bengal, the same lesson echoed across continents. Empire was not merely about territory or trade, but about people. It was about connections forged, challenges met, and lives reshaped in ways that were immediate and enduring. The story of Asia's expansion offers both marvel and caution. Marvel at the scale and ingenuity of human organization, caution at the costs borne by those who lived under distant rule. The horizon glowed with the first light of dawn over the Kenyan highlands, where mist clung to the fertile valleys and the scent of damp earth rose from the soil. Once, these lands had been claimed by settlers under the British flag, their farms sprawling across the most fertile regions, displacing local communities and imposing foreign rules. The echoes of imperial authority still lingered in the air, yet beneath them, a wave of resistance was brewing, a determination that had quietly grown over decades. Across continents, from India to Africa, the machinery of empire had reached its peak, but the forces of human ambition, local identity, and global political change were beginning to dismantle it. In Ghana, the Gold Coast, the narrative was one of organized political awakening. Cocoa plantations, timber enterprises, and mineral extraction had long bound the local economy to British interests, but educated elites and rural organizers began to challenge the narrative that colonial oversight was benevolent. Kwame Nkrumah and his contemporaries galvanized mass movements that demanded not gradual reform, but immediate self-government. Strikes, boycotts, and political mobilization demonstrated that governance was not merely a right granted by the crown, it was a claim that local populations could assert for themselves. In 1957, Ghana achieved independence, becoming the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free in the post-war era. The story was not just political, it was profoundly human, with countless families, villages, and communities directly participating in the struggle for self-determination. Meanwhile, in Malaya, the story was more tangled. The economic importance of rubber plantations and tin mines drew Britain's attention, and the Japanese occupation during World War II shattered the myth of invincible imperial authority. Communist-led guerrillas took to the jungles after 1945, fighting what they perceived as a continuation of anti-imperialist struggle. The British termed it the emergency, an attempt to avoid the politically explosive word war. Counterinsurgency campaigns, rural resettlements, and political reforms became tools in a protracted conflict that drained both resources and moral authority. And yet, amidst this turmoil, pathways to self-government slowly emerged. By 1957, the Federation of Malaya achieved independence, demonstrating that even amidst violence and tension, negotiation and adaptation could yield sovereignty. In Kenya, resistance was raw, visceral, and unflinching. European settlers had claimed the most fertile lands, displacing Kikuyu and other communities. Grievances over land, labor, and racial discrimination had simmered for decades. By the 1950s, a militant movement labeled Mau Mau by the British emerged, drawing fighters from the dispossessed population. The colonial response was brutal. Thousands were detained in camps, subjected to interrogation, forced labor, and collective punishment. Villages were fenced and populations forcibly relocated. Violence was committed by both guerrillas and colonial forces, leaving scars that would endure for generations. Yet even this harsh suppression could not prevent the inevitable. By 1963, Kenya would move toward independence. The human cost of empire, pain, resilience, and survival was etched into the landscape itself. Nigeria followed a different trajectory. Constitutional conferences, gradual transfer of power, and carefully managed negotiations culminated in independence in 1960. Yet internal divisions along ethnic, regional, and religious lines revealed the complexity of transferring authority after decades of centralized colonial governance. Across Asia and Africa, the pattern was consistent. Britain, weakened and indebted, faced populations that were politically active and increasingly aware of their agency. The world stage had shifted, with the United Nations advocating human rights and self-determination, and global powers like the United States and the Soviet Union influencing outcomes, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. The Suez Crisis of 1956 crystallized Britain's diminished imperial influence. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital artery linking Europe to Asian and African trade. Britain and France, seeking to reassert control, conspired with Israel in a military intervention. On the surface, it appeared to be a classic exercise of imperial power. Yet the world had changed. The United States, unwilling to be sidelined and wary of driving Arab states toward the Soviet sphere, refused support. International pressure, including financial market reactions, forced Britain to withdraw. The crisis was a stark demonstration that empire could no longer act independently. It had to negotiate within a new global order. Even as independence movements swept across continents, the human dimension remained central. Families, workers, and local communities were the engines of both resistance and adaptation. In India, for example, partition in 1947 created not just new nations but also immense human suffering. Millions were displaced, communities fractured, and borders drawn with immediate, lasting impact on lives. In Africa, independence brought hope but also uncertainty, as new governments faced the legacy of colonial administration, unequal land distribution, and fractured economies. Across the globe, the human cost of empire, both in its exercise and in its dissolution, was undeniable. The empire's retreat was neither uniform nor linear. Some colonies transitioned relatively peacefully. Others experienced prolonged violence, coups, and civil strife. Hong Kong, a late acquisition, remained under British control until 1997, when a negotiated agreement with China transferred sovereignty under a one-country, two-systems framework. It became a symbol of the empire's final retreat. A densely populated, economically vital territory returned to a rising global power, while retaining distinct legal and economic structures. Throughout these transformations, the Commonwealth emerged as a new structure. Evolving from self-governing dominions, it now included republics, former colonies and monarchies, joined voluntarily, sharing education, trade and cultural programs. While lacking the coercive authority of empire, it preserved connections, networks and ceremonial ties. For many, it became both a practical forum and a symbolic reminder of historical interconnections. Empire left enduring legacies. Borders drawn during colonial rule continue to define nations. Trade networks, financial institutions, and legal systems established under British administration persist in various forms. English, in its myriad accents, functions as a global lingua franca. Diasporas connect continents, carrying memories, languages, and cultural practices shaped in part by imperial networks. Yet these legacies are double-edged. Opportunities created for some were built on the exploitation and marginalization of others. Railways, ports, plantations, and administrative systems facilitated commerce and governance but also enforced hierarchies and inequalities. Famines, forced labor, and land dispossession were not anomalies but intrinsic elements of the system. History, therefore, demands nuanced reckoning. Empire was both creativity and coercion, opportunity and oppression, connection and extraction. The narratives of those who lived under, resisted, and navigated imperial rule illuminate the complexity of human experience in these periods. They reveal resilience, adaptation, and ingenuity amid structures designed for control and extraction. As we observe the post-colonial world, the afterimage of empire is evident. Economic inequalities, legal systems, linguistic patterns, and cultural institutions all carry traces of the past. Yet the human stories of resistance, survival, adaptation, and aspiration persist, reminding us that history is not just a series of policies and conquests but a tapestry of lived experience. From the fields of Ghana to the jungles of Malaya, from the ports of Calcutta to the highlands of Kenya, individuals shaped and were shaped by the currents of empire. The British Empire did not vanish overnight, it transformed. Its formal authority receded, but its imprint remained, interwoven with global trade, culture, governance, and human aspiration. The decline of empire was not just political, it was deeply human, marked by negotiation, resilience, suffering, and hope. Each independence movement, each act of resistance, each story of adaptation contributed to a complex legacy that endures today. As dusk settled over Nairobi, Calcutta, and Kuala Lumpur, the echoes of empire remained, visible in cities, institutions, languages, and in the very lives of people who inherited both its opportunities and its burdens. The story of decline, like the story of expansion, is not complete without recognizing the human dimension, the courage, creativity, and endurance of those who lived through it, and the lessons that continue to shape nations and societies. And as night falls over continents once connected by imperial ambition, the story trans. The sun rises over the bustling streets of London, where skyscrapers of glass and steel reflect centuries of history, and the hum of commerce pulses through the veins of the city. Yet beyond the skyline, beyond the banks and trading floors, one can trace invisible threads stretching across oceans, continents, and generations. These threads are the enduring legacies of the British Empire, not in the form of flags or colonies, but woven into borders, trade systems, languages, and the very rhythms of daily life. Walk through a map of modern Africa and Asia, and you will see the fingerprints of empire etched in the lines of nations. Borders drawn hastily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often ignoring ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities, still define modern states. In Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, the political geography bears the mark of decisions made in London offices far removed from the lived realities of local populations. Rivers, mountains, and deserts became convenient boundaries for administrators seeking order, yet these lines often split communities, seeded conflict, and imposed new political structures. Understanding these borders is to read a story of human ambition, bureaucratic reasoning, and the enduring consequences of distant governance. Trade, too, bears the imprint of history. Shipping routes that once carried tea from India, cocoa from West Africa, and spices from the Caribbean still shape global commerce. Ports in Singapore, Hong Kong, Mumbai, and Cape Town grew under British oversight, strategically placed to serve empire-wide networks. These ports now thrive in a globalized world, hubs of commerce and innovation, yet they carry the memory of centuries of extraction, of wealth flowing from colony to metropole. Insurance markets, stock exchanges, and financial institutions founded during colonial times continue to influence global capital flows, often linking continents in ways that mirror historical trade patterns. Language is another enduring thread. English, in its many accents and dialects, functions as a global lingua franca. From the classrooms of Delhi to the boardrooms of Toronto, from university lecture halls in Cape Town to government offices in Singapore, English is spoken not because it is native to these lands, but because of a historical process of administration, education, and communication imposed by empire. Yet this language carries duality. It is both a tool of connection and opportunity, and a reminder of cultural imposition. Many former colonies have adapted English to their own contexts, creating unique dialects, literatures, and forms of expression, transforming an instrument of control into one of identity. Human stories animate these legacies. In London's vibrant neighborhoods, Caribbean immigrants recall stories of leaving islands shaped by plantation economies and colonial rule, seeking opportunity in the metropole that had once ruled their homelands. South Asian families in Birmingham or Vancouver recount the migrations that connected continents, livelihoods, and cultures. Nigerians in Manchester, Hong Kongers in Vancouver, and communities across the globe trace ancestral journeys first shaped by colonial transportation, labor recruitment, and administrative directives. These human currents reveal a global diaspora connected by memory, language, and shared histories of movement and adaptation. Legal systems, too, carry the mark of imperial design. Courtrooms in Nairobi, Mumbai, Kingston, and Melbourne operate with procedures, titles, and legal language rooted in Westminster traditions. These institutions, originally meant to serve colonial administration, have been appropriated and adapted by independent nations to serve local governance, justice, and societal needs. Universities founded to educate clerks, administrators, and professionals for a British-shaped world now produce leaders, critics, and scholars shaping post-colonial societies. Here, history is alive in the mundane, the everyday practice of law, education, and civic life. Yet the economic and social legacies are not neutral. Railways, ports, and telegraphs, while now conduits for commerce and communication, were originally built to extract wealth and control populations. Land redistribution, taxation systems, and resource management favored imperial priorities. Famines in India, forced labor in Africa and the Caribbean, and resource exploitation in Asia were not incidental. They were integral to the functioning of empire. The structures that once enabled extraction now support commerce, travel, and communication. But the inequalities rooted in history continue to affect global wealth distribution and development. Cultural practices, too, bear dual legacies. Sports like cricket, education curricula, literary traditions, and ceremonial practices in former colonies often trace back to imperial influence. At the same time, these practices have been transformed, localized, and imbued with new meanings. Festivals, sporting rivalries, and academic institutions carry histories of adaptation and resistance, a reminder that culture is not static, but continuously negotiated and reshaped. Curiosity and mystery persist in the way these legacies intersect with daily life. Walk along the docks of Singapore or the streets of Mumbai, and you may find buildings, institutions, and street layouts designed to optimize control and administration centuries ago, yet now serving as hubs of creativity, trade, and interaction. Markets, ports, and railways hum with energy shaped by global capital flows, echoing patterns established under imperial designs. At once familiar and alien, these spaces provoke reflection on the intertwined history of power, resistance, and adaptation. In education, the empire's influence continues subtly. Curricula, examinations, and universities often trace back to British models. Yet local populations have appropriated these systems to educate their own citizens, promote development, and create intellectual traditions that reflect post-colonial realities. Science, literature, and law have been adapted to new contexts, producing a blend of inherited structure and indigenous creativity. The human capacity to transform imposed systems into instruments of empowerment speaks to resilience, innovation, and the enduring agency of people navigating legacies. Migration patterns, both historical and contemporary, illustrate the empire's deep influence. Caribbean, South Asian, African, and Pacific communities relocated across continents due to labor demands, administrative directives, and economic opportunity. Today, these diasporas maintain cultural, linguistic, and economic links across borders. Remittances, shared languages, festivals, and professional networks connect cities as diverse as London, Toronto, Sydney, and Durban. Globalization, in many ways, rides on currents established centuries ago, linking distant lands in human, cultural, and economic exchange. Yet perhaps the most compelling aspect of this legacy is its duality. The same structures that facilitated opportunity, education, and global connection were once instruments of control, coercion, and inequality. Infrastructure, trade networks, legal systems, and language continue to shape possibilities, but they also carry memories of extraction, dispossession, and cultural imposition. This tension, between opportunity and oppression, inheritance and adaptation, is central to understanding the empire's enduring impact. As one reflects on modern cities, institutions, and global networks, the influence of the British Empire becomes palpable. Financial centers in London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Toronto, and Sydney echo trade patterns established centuries ago. Legal systems in Nairobi, Delhi, Lagos, and Melbourne retain procedural structures shaped under Westminster traditions. English, spoken in countless dialects, functions as a bridge across nations. Educational and professional systems carry frameworks initially designed to serve imperial administration. And the movement of people, diasporas across continents, continues to weave a web of cultural and economic connections rooted in history. Yet these legacies are alive, dynamic, and contested. Former colonies have appropriated, transformed, and reinterpreted inherited structures. Communities negotiate the advantages and limitations of global systems shaped by history. Borders, legal frameworks, languages, and institutions become arenas of innovation, contestation, and adaptation. What was once designed to control and extract now offers opportunities for governance, commerce, education, and cultural exchange. The empire may have receded, but its imprint remains in the architecture of modern society. And so, as evening descends across continents, the story of empire is not one of simple conquest or decline, but of continuity and transformation. The world shaped by British expansion continues to resonate, in trade routes that crisscross oceans, languages that connect diverse communities, legal and educational institutions that organize societies, and human stories of adaptation and resilience. History flows through the streets, ports, classrooms, and marketplaces, connecting past and present, reminding us that the legacies of empire are neither fully distant nor entirely erased. The British Empire, once vast and commanding, now exists in echoes, structural, cultural, linguistic, and economic. Yet in these echoes lies the human story, the ingenuity, resistance, adaptation, and aspiration of millions whose lives intertwined with imperial history. This legacy invites reflection, understanding, and exploration. It challenges us to see the connections between past and present, to trace invisible threads across continents, and to understand how history continues to shape the opportunities, inequalities, and identities of the modern world. And as night falls over London, New Delhi, Nairobi, and Kingston, the story of the empire's legacy remains unfinished, a living tapestry of human experience, structural inheritance, and the ongoing dialogue between history and modernity. It is here, in this continuum, that the story of empire meets the story of the world today. The sun rose over the sprawling plantations of India, casting long shadows over fields of cotton and tea that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. But behind this serene beauty lay a story of extraction and imposition, a story of wealth flowing outwards while the land beneath quivered under the weight of human labor. Imagine the bustling ports of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras in the 18th and 19th centuries, ships lined like silent giants, their hulls brimming with raw cotton, spices, indigo, and tea. Each crate and bale represented not just trade, but a system meticulously designed to prioritize British profit over the lives and welfare of those who tilled the land. It is difficult to overstate the scale of this economic enterprise. By the mid-19th century, India alone provided Britain with nearly one-fifth of its global imports of raw cotton. Sugar from the Caribbean, rubber from Malaya, cocoa from West Africa. All were funneled into the arteries of an empire that viewed colonies primarily as warehouses of resources. The local populations, meanwhile, often saw little improvement in their own lives. Villages were reorganized to serve export demands, forests cleared to make way for plantations, and traditional crafts undermined as imported goods replaced local production. Consider the story of a young boy, Arjun, in a small village in Bengal. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, he would carry baskets of indigo leaves to the nearest processing center. His father had worked the same land, harvesting crops for generations, yet the introduction of cash crops for export meant that their traditional rice fields had been reduced, leading to famine and scarcity in the village. Arjun's hands, calloused and blistered, told the story that no ledger or export report could capture: the human cost of economic exploitation. Historians have estimated that the extraction of wealth from colonies to the British treasury was staggering. Between 1765 and 1860, India alone contributed roughly 25% of Britain's total revenue. These numbers were not mere statistics. They reflected lives reshaped, societies redirected, and economies subordinated to the demands of a distant empire. While Britain celebrated its industrial revolution, powered by resources from across its dominions, the colonies bore the brunt of environmental degradation, economic dependency, and social upheaval. The Caribbean islands present a similarly haunting picture. Sugarcane plantations, stretching like green oceans across Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, relied on forced labor, first of enslaved Africans, and later indentured laborers from India. Ships arriving from Britain demanded increasing yields, and the plantation owners, backed by colonial administrators, extracted labor relentlessly. Families were broken apart, and generations grew up under the shadow of coercion. The wealth generated, the sugar that sweetened the teas and desserts of London, rarely trickled back into the communities that produced it. Instead, it lined the pockets of a colonial elite and funded further expansion of the empire. This system was not just about crops or raw materials. It extended to minerals, timber, and every resource deemed valuable in global markets. The gold mines of South Africa, the tin mines of Malaya, the timber from Nigeria, all were controlled with a single-minded focus on extraction. Colonists often imposed taxes in cash rather than in kind, forcing local populations to produce goods they could sell to meet these obligations, further entrenching dependency on colonial trade networks. But economic exploitation was never merely about economics. It was deeply entwined with governance and power. Colonial administrations designed legal codes, tax structures, and land tenure systems to favor the empire's needs. Courts and revenue offices became instruments of control. When local resistance arose, sometimes in subtle refusals to meet quotas, other times in open rebellion, it was met with military intervention, legal penalties, or forced labor programs. In places like Kenya and Malaya, insurgencies and uprisings often traced their roots directly to these economic pressures, revealing a complex web where profit and power were inseparable. Amid this grand narrative of extraction, there were stories of ingenuity and resilience. Traders and local intermediaries found ways to navigate the imperial system, sometimes profiting, sometimes protecting communities. In West Africa, cocoa farmers negotiated with European companies to maintain some control over crop quality and prices, learning the subtle arts of leverage and negotiation. Yet, these instances were exceptions in a system designed overwhelmingly to favor the imperial center. Scientific studies of the era also highlight the unintended consequences of economic exploitation. Soil depletion, deforestation, and monoculture practices, implemented to maximize exports, led to long-term environmental degradation. Famines in India during the 19th century, most notably the Great Bengal Famine of 1770 and the later famines under colonial rule, were exacerbated by policies that prioritized cash crops over local food production. While British officials often attributed these crises to weather or mismanagement, historians now understand the systemic nature of extraction that placed empire's profit above human life. The mystery of economic exploitation lies not only in its scale but in its subtle persistence. Even as colonies gained independence in the 20th century, the patterns established during centuries of extraction continued to shape trade, wealth distribution, and economic opportunity. Ports, railways, and financial centers established to serve imperial extraction became instruments of post-colonial growth, yet often in ways that mirrored the inequalities of the past. Consider the bustling port of Accra in Ghana today. Ships still unload cocoa, now for global trade, and factories process timber and minerals. The infrastructure laid down during British rule enabled modern commerce, yet the question remains: who benefits most from these activities? The echoes of extraction reverberate through generations, shaping societies in ways that are subtle, pervasive, and deeply intertwined with the empire's legacy. And so, the story of economic exploitation is not just about numbers or profits. It is about landscapes transformed, communities reshaped, and lives navigated within a system designed to favor distant rulers. It is about children like Arjun, families displaced, and entire societies oriented toward export and extraction rather than local well-being. It is about the tension between opportunity and oppression, ingenuity and coercion, local agency and imperial control. This narrative, steeped in human experience, historical data, and a cinematic vision of the empire's reach, begins to answer the question: how does one small island exert such monumental influence over vast continents and millions of lives? How does the machinery of trade and governance entwine with the most intimate aspects of everyday life? And most intriguingly, how did these systems survive, adapt, and leave traces that persist into our modern global economy? The heat of the midday sun beat down relentlessly on the Caribbean plantations, casting a shimmer across the endless rows of sugarcane. From a distance, it looked like a sea of green stretching to the horizon, but the serenity was deceptive. Beneath the tall stalks, generations of laborers toiled, harvesting sugar that would ultimately sweeten the tables of London, Edinburgh, and Liverpool. The story of economic exploitation in the Caribbean began centuries earlier with the forced migration of enslaved Africans, ripped from their homes, families shattered, languages silenced. Even after abolition, the labor continued through systems of indenture, bringing workers from India, China, and other colonies, each generation bound to land and production quotas that served distant markets more than local lives. Ships laden with sugar, molasses, and rum sailed across the Atlantic, their hulls heavy with the fruits of relentless extraction. Ports like Kingston, Bridgetown, and Port of Spain were more than centers of trade. They were arteries of an empire, pumping wealth outward while leaving the source lands impoverished and ecologically stressed. Plantation owners, often British absentee landlords, rarely set foot in the colonies, yet the administrative machinery ensured that their profits remained uninterrupted. Agents, overseers, and colonial administrators orchestrated production schedules, tax collection, and labor deployment with meticulous precision, leaving little room for local negotiation. In West Africa, cocoa farms in Ghana and Ivory Coast mirrored the Caribbean pattern, though the crops differed. Villages were reorganized to produce cocoa for European markets, often at the expense of local food production. Families like that of Kwame, a farmer in the Ashanti region, were caught in an unending cycle of planting, harvesting, and shipping, their lives governed by export demands rather than seasons or community needs. Schools, roads, and infrastructure were built, yes, but primarily to facilitate extraction. Railways carried cocoa and timber to ports, not to connect villages, and warehouses stood as silent reminders of the empire's priorities. The story of South Africa's gold and diamond mines further illuminates the mechanics of colonial exploitation. European settlers claimed fertile lands and mineral-rich regions, often displacing local populations entirely. Thousands were recruited, or coerced, into labor, living in cramped compounds, their wages barely sufficient to survive. The famous Kimberley mines, with their sprawling pits and deep shafts, became both symbols of opportunity and testimony to the harsh realities of extraction. Each diamond and ounce of gold that left Africa represented not only economic wealth for Britain but also lives structured around toil and control. Across the Indian Ocean, the fields of India tell another chapter of the same story. Cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium were cultivated not for local markets but to satisfy British industry and finance its imperial ambitions. Farmers were compelled to grow these crops, often abandoning traditional food production, which led to famine and starvation. The Bengal famine of 1943 is a harrowing example. Millions perished while vast quantities of rice were exported to fund the British war effort. Scientific studies suggest that policies prioritizing export over sustenance amplified the human cost. Yet, in the colonial reports, these tragedies were often downplayed or attributed to weather or mismanagement rather than systemic exploitation. Even the forests of Southeast Asia were not spared. The rubber plantations of Malaya and Burma expanded rapidly in response to global demand, driven by the Industrial Revolution's insatiable need for tires, belts, and industrial goods. Local laborers, often recruited under harsh contracts, faced long hours, tropical diseases, and minimal compensation. Tin mines, similarly, became the backbone of colonial revenue, with mining towns constructed in ways that benefited the empire far more than the workers or their families. Resistance, both subtle and overt, arose frequently. Workers sabotaged production, fled plantations, or organized strikes. But these efforts were met with military and administrative suppression. Beyond labor and land, economic exploitation extended into taxation, legal structures, and currency control. In India, the introduction of land revenue systems forced peasants to pay taxes in cash rather than in kind, compelling them to participate in the colonial economy even when it disrupted traditional practices. Local courts enforced these regulations, often with harsh penalties for non-compliance, and colonial bureaucrats ensured that wealth extracted from the countryside flowed to Britain's treasury. The empire was not merely a political construct. It was an economic machine, designed with precision to maximize profit while minimizing local autonomy. Yet, within this system of extraction, human stories emerged that reveal both suffering and resilience. In Jamaica, families adapted to the cycles of sugar production, developing community networks to survive the long hours and exploitative demands. In India, village leaders negotiated with British administrators to secure better prices for crops or to preserve essential food production, demonstrating ingenuity within constraining structures. In Africa, women often managed households while men were conscripted to work in mines or on plantations, maintaining cultural practices and traditions even under oppressive circumstances. These narratives remind us that the history of exploitation is never one-dimensional. It encompasses struggle, adaptation, and subtle resistance. Environmental consequences accompanied economic extraction, creating long-term impacts that shaped both the land and the societies inhabiting it. Monoculture farming depleted soils, deforestation reduced biodiversity, and the diversion of rivers for irrigation often disrupted local ecosystems. Colonial administrators focused on profit, rarely accounted for sustainability, leading to famines, erosion, and a legacy of environmental stress that persists today. Modern studies have traced many of these challenges back to policies enacted centuries ago, revealing the hidden costs of the empire's economic ambitions. Trade routes, too, tell a story of both connection and coercion. The global shipping lanes linking Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and Europe were carefully mapped to optimize resource flow. Ports became hubs not only for trade but also for surveillance and control. British naval power enforced these routes, protecting merchant ships and suppressing piracy, ensuring that wealth reached London and other imperial centers without interruption. The mystery lies in the sophistication of this system. Thousands of miles of ocean, hundreds of ports, countless laborers, and yet the machinery worked with remarkable efficiency, revealing the meticulous planning behind colonial economics. The curiosity of economic exploitation extends beyond mere profit. It encompasses the way societies were reshaped, often unknowingly. Markets once local and communal became globalized under the empire's influence. Currency systems, weights, and measures were standardized for trade efficiency. Railroads and ports, while facilitating commerce, also bound colonies into a pattern that served imperial interests. Over decades, these systems became embedded in daily life, creating legacies that persisted long after independence. As we move from the Caribbean to Africa, from India to Southeast Asia, one observes recurring patterns: extraction, control, resilience, and adaptation. The British Empire's economic exploitation was not random. It was systematic, strategic, and relentless. Yet, it was also met with human ingenuity and resistance that, though often constrained, shaped the eventual pathways to independence. Communities learned, adapted, and sometimes subtly undermined the very systems designed to oppress them. These stories of negotiation, resilience, and survival provide depth to the otherwise stark narrative of extraction and profit. Even in contemporary times, the echoes of economic exploitation remain visible. Ports, railways, plantations, and financial systems established to serve colonial interests continue to influence trade and commerce. Former colonies navigate global markets using infrastructure, legal frameworks, and institutions inherited from the empire. The wealth extracted during colonial times laid the foundation for Britain's industrial expansion, yet the social and economic consequences for local populations endure in ways both visible and hidden, shaping patterns of inequality and opportunity. The story of economic exploitation within the British Empire was never only about land, crops, or minerals. Beneath the visible systems of plantations, mines, and trade routes existed something even more powerful and subtle: control over political structures and economic rules themselves. The empire did not merely take resources. It redesigned entire societies so that extraction would continue smoothly for generations. By the late 19th century, the machinery of empire had evolved into something extraordinarily sophisticated. It no longer depended solely on military conquest. Instead, it relied on laws, bureaucracies, taxes, and economic policies that quietly ensured the steady flow of wealth toward Britain. To understand this system, imagine walking through a colonial administrative building somewhere in British India in the early 20th century. Tall wooden doors open into long corridors lined with clerks and officials. Stacks of paper sit on polished desks: land records, taxation reports, crop statistics, export figures. At first glance, it appears to be nothing more than an ordinary government office. But inside these records lies the hidden architecture of economic control. Every acre of farmland is documented. Every harvest is estimated. Every shipment to the ports is accounted for. The empire had built a system that could measure, monitor, and manage entire economies thousands of miles away from London. This bureaucratic power became one of the most effective tools of colonial exploitation. By carefully designing taxation policies, colonial governments forced local populations to participate in the imperial economy. In many parts of Africa, for example, people were required to pay taxes in cash rather than goods. At first glance, this might seem like a simple administrative rule. But in practice, it forced villagers who had previously lived through subsistence farming to enter the colonial labor system. If someone needed money to pay taxes, they had little choice but to work in plantations, mines, or colonial infrastructure projects. In places like Kenya, this system became known as the hut tax. Families had to pay a fixed amount of money simply to live in their homes. Since traditional economies often did not use cash extensively, men were compelled to leave their villages and work in colonial industries to earn the required money. Over time, entire communities became tied to labor systems that served the empire's economic interests. The effects were profound. Villages that had once been economically independent slowly became dependent on colonial markets. Traditional agricultural cycles began to change. Families were separated as men traveled long distances to work in mines or plantations. The economy of the colony slowly transformed into an extension of Britain's global economic network. But taxation was only one piece of the system. Trade policies played an equally powerful role. The British Empire carefully controlled what colonies could produce, what they could sell, and where they could trade. Colonies were encouraged, or sometimes forced, to export raw materials to Britain while importing manufactured goods from British factories. This arrangement created a powerful economic dependency. India offers one of the clearest examples of this transformation. Before British colonial rule expanded in the 18th century, India was famous for its textile industry. Indian cotton fabrics were highly valued across the world for their quality and craftsmanship. Cities such as Dhaka and Murshidabad were thriving centers of textile production, employing thousands of skilled artisans. But as Britain's Industrial Revolution gained momentum, the empire needed markets for its factory-produced textiles. British policies gradually shifted the balance. Raw cotton from India was exported to textile mills in cities like Manchester and Liverpool. These factories produced large quantities of cheaper cloth, which were then sold back to Indian markets. The result was devastating for many local artisans. One historical account tells the story of a weaver living near Dhaka in the early 19th century. His family had been weaving fine cotton fabric for generations. Their craft required patience and extraordinary skill. Each piece of cloth could take weeks to complete. But as imported British textiles flooded the market, the demand for locally woven fabrics collapsed. Prices fell. Orders disappeared. Within a generation, thousands of skilled weavers were forced to abandon their craft. This transformation was not simply an economic shift. It reshaped entire communities and traditions. Historians estimate that India's share of global manufacturing declined dramatically during the period of British colonial rule. While Britain's industrial economy grew rapidly, many Indian industries declined under the pressure of imperial trade policies. Yet the story of colonial economic systems was not entirely one-sided. Across the empire, resistance slowly began to grow. Sometimes resistance appeared in dramatic forms, rebellions, protests, or organized political movements. But more often it appeared quietly in everyday acts of defiance. In plantations across the Caribbean, workers slowed their pace, sabotaged equipment, or negotiated collective demands for better conditions. In Africa, farmers sometimes secretly continued growing traditional food crops instead of the cash crops demanded by colonial administrators. In India, merchants formed informal networks to support local industries and bypass colonial trade restrictions. These acts might seem small, but collectively they represented something powerful: a refusal to accept the economic structures imposed by the empire. By the early 20th century, these currents of resistance began to merge with new political movements that demanded independence and economic self-determination. In India, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi recognized that economic control was at the heart of colonial rule. One of Gandhi's most famous campaigns focused on something as simple as cloth. The Swadeshi movement encouraged Indians to boycott British textiles and instead produce and wear locally made cloth. Gandhi himself famously spun cotton thread using a traditional spinning wheel known as the charkha. This simple act became a powerful symbol of economic independence. By rejecting British goods and supporting local production, millions of Indians participated in a peaceful form of economic resistance. What began as a small movement gradually became a nationwide campaign that challenged the economic foundations of colonial rule. Similar movements were emerging across the empire. In West Africa, educated elites began to question colonial economic policies that prioritized exports over local development. In the Caribbean, labor unions formed to demand better wages and working conditions. Across Southeast Asia, nationalist movements connected economic exploitation with broader struggles for political independence. These movements revealed something important about the empire's economic system. It depended heavily on cooperation from local populations. Once that cooperation began to weaken, the structure itself started to show cracks. Meanwhile, the global economy itself was changing. The early 20th century brought enormous upheavals. World wars disrupted trade routes and strained imperial finances. Colonies that had once been sources of wealth increasingly required military and administrative resources to maintain control. During the World War I and later the World War II, colonies provided soldiers, food supplies, and raw materials for Britain's war efforts. Millions of people from India, Africa, and the Caribbean served in imperial armies. But these wars also changed how many colonial subjects viewed the empire. Soldiers who had fought alongside Europeans began to question why they lacked the same political and economic rights. At the same time, global ideas about freedom and self-determination were spreading rapidly. International organizations, new political ideologies, and anti-colonial movements began to challenge the legitimacy of empire itself. By the mid-20th century, the economic logic that had once sustained the British Empire was beginning to unravel. Colonies demanded control over their own resources. Nationalist leaders argued that local economies should serve local populations rather than distant imperial markets. Independence movements gained momentum across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. One by one, colonies began to achieve independence. India became independent in 1947. Ghana followed in 1957. Many other nations soon followed, marking the gradual end of one of the largest empires in world history. Yet even as political control faded, the economic legacy of empire remained deeply embedded in global systems. Railways built for colonial trade continued to shape transportation networks. Ports constructed to export raw materials remained central to national economies. Legal systems and financial institutions created during colonial rule continued to influence governance and trade. Modern economists often study these patterns to understand why some regions developed differently than others. In many former colonies, economic structures established during the imperial period still influence patterns of trade, inequality, and development. For example, many countries continue to rely heavily on exporting raw materials rather than producing manufactured goods. This pattern reflects economic relationships established during colonial times when colonies were structured primarily as suppliers of resources. But history is never static. Across the world today, former colonies are reshaping their economies, investing in technology, industry, and education. Nations that were once part of the empire are redefining their place in the global economy in ways that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. And yet, the story of economic exploitation remains an essential chapter in understanding how the modern world came to be. The railways stretching across India, the cocoa farms of West Africa, the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and the ports of Southeast Asia all carry echoes of a time when a distant empire coordinated the movement of goods, labor, and wealth across oceans. Understanding this history is not merely about the past. It is about recognizing the deep connections between global systems, human stories, and the choices societies make about power and resources. And as we continue exploring the rise and decline of the British Empire, an even deeper question begins to emerge. If economic systems could shape entire continents for centuries, then what finally caused those systems to collapse? That story begins with something even more powerful than economics alone: the growing force of resistance, identity, and the universal human desire for freedom. It is easy to imagine empires as armies marching across continents or fleets of ships crossing distant oceans. But the most powerful weapon of the British Empire was often something far quieter and less visible. It was not always a soldier, a cannon, or a warship that extended imperial power. Sometimes it was a desk, a ledger, a law book, or a government office. At its height, the British Empire governed nearly a quarter of the world's population, stretching across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Yet the empire could not rule millions of people with soldiers alone. Instead, it created something far more enduring and subtle: a vast system of administration, bureaucracy, and law that reached into everyday life in its colonies. And in many ways, the systems built during that time still shape the institutions of modern nations today. Imagine a quiet morning in a colonial administrative building in the early 20th century. The building stands tall with wide verandas, thick stone walls, and large wooden doors designed to withstand the heat of tropical climates. Inside, clerks sit at long desks covered with papers, maps, and official seals. Ink bottles and stamps sit beside thick ledgers filled with records of land ownership, tax payments, court decisions, and census reports. At first glance, the scene may appear ordinary, almost routine. But within these rooms, decisions are being made that affect the lives of thousands, sometimes millions, of people. Laws are written, taxes are calculated, and policies are drafted. From these offices, the empire quietly organizes and controls vast territories thousands of miles away from London. This system of administrative governance was one of the defining features of the British Empire. Instead of relying purely on military force, the empire built complex bureaucratic structures designed to manage populations, resources, and territory. These systems included civil services, legal courts, taxation departments, and regional administrative offices. Over time, these institutions created a framework of governance that allowed a relatively small number of British officials to oversee enormous regions. One of the most famous examples of this administrative structure was the Indian Civil Service, often referred to as the ICS. In the 19th century, the ICS became the backbone of British governance in India. Its members were carefully selected through competitive examinations and trained to administer districts, manage revenue systems, and enforce colonial laws. By the late 1800s, the ICS governed hundreds of millions of people across the Indian subcontinent. Historians often describe the Indian Civil Service as one of the most powerful bureaucracies in the world at the time. Each district officer had immense authority. A single official could oversee tax collection, law enforcement, infrastructure development, and judicial decisions across vast rural regions. These officers maintained detailed records of crops, land ownership, and population data. The empire depended on this information to manage its territories efficiently. But the influence of colonial administration went beyond paperwork and offices. It reshaped how governance itself functioned in many parts of the world. In many colonies, British administrators introduced legal systems based on English common law. Courts were established to handle disputes, interpret laws, and enforce regulations. These systems often replaced or altered traditional forms of justice that had existed for centuries. Consider the experience of a small farmer in colonial India in the late 19th century. If a dispute arose over land ownership, the case might be brought before a colonial court where judges relied on written legal codes and documented evidence. This process was very different from traditional village councils where disputes were often resolved through community discussion and local customs. For some people, these new systems offered certain advantages. Written laws and formal courts could sometimes provide more consistent rulings than informal local systems. But they also introduced complexities and power imbalances. Navigating colonial legal institutions required knowledge of laws, procedures, and languages that many local populations did not possess. As a result, colonial courts often favored those who were educated in the new legal systems or had connections within the colonial administration. Across Africa, similar administrative structures began to emerge as the British expanded their influence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Colonial governments divided territories into districts and provinces, each managed by appointed officials. These administrators were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and implementing colonial policies. One common method used in Africa was known as indirect rule, a system strongly associated with Frederick Lugard. Instead of replacing traditional leaders entirely, colonial authorities sometimes governed through existing chiefs and local authorities. These leaders were expected to enforce colonial laws and collect taxes while maintaining a degree of traditional authority. In theory, indirect rule allowed colonial governments to manage large populations with relatively few European officials. In practice, it often reshaped traditional power structures. Some local leaders gained new authority through their cooperation with colonial administrations, while others lost influence if they resisted imperial policies. This blending of colonial bureaucracy and traditional leadership created complex political systems that would continue to shape governance long after the empire itself faded. But perhaps the most lasting impact of British administrative governance was its emphasis on documentation and record-keeping. Census reports, land surveys, and economic data became essential tools for managing colonial territories. In India, for example, colonial authorities conducted detailed land surveys to measure agricultural productivity and determine tax rates. These surveys created extensive maps and records that documented villages, farms, and irrigation systems across vast regions. Similar surveys were conducted in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. These records served an important purpose for the empire. They allowed administrators to calculate taxes, monitor production, and plan infrastructure projects such as railways and canals. But they also produced something unexpected. For many regions, these colonial records became the first systematic documentation of populations, languages, and geographic boundaries. Ironically, the same administrative tools that helped maintain imperial control later became resources for newly independent nations. Census systems, legal codes, and civil services developed during colonial rule often became the foundations of modern governments. In countries like India, Pakistan, Kenya, and Malaysia, many government institutions today still follow administrative structures originally introduced during the colonial era. Civil service examinations, district administration systems, and legal frameworks often trace their origins to these imperial bureaucracies. Yet the legacy of colonial governance is complex and sometimes controversial. While administrative systems brought certain forms of organization and infrastructure, they were primarily designed to serve imperial interests. Taxes, laws, and economic policies were often structured to benefit the colonial economy rather than local populations. For instance, colonial land laws sometimes redefined ownership in ways that disrupted traditional land use practices. In some regions, communal lands were converted into private property to simplify taxation and agricultural production for export crops. These changes could reshape entire communities and agricultural systems. At the same time, education systems established during the colonial period created new social classes of administrators, lawyers, and professionals. Many of the leaders who later led independence movements were themselves educated within these colonial institutions. They understood the bureaucratic structures of the empire and used that knowledge to challenge it. Figures like Jawaharlal Nehru and Kwame Nkrumah were deeply familiar with the administrative systems created by colonial rule. When their countries gained independence, these leaders inherited both the strengths and limitations of those institutions. Over time, newly independent nations began adapting and reforming these systems to serve their own goals. Laws were rewritten, civil services were expanded, and administrative structures were reshaped to reflect local priorities. Yet traces of the imperial system remain visible even today. Parliamentary governments, judicial frameworks, and administrative divisions across many former colonies still reflect elements of British governance. Even the language of law and administration often carries echoes of the colonial past. Looking back, it becomes clear that the British Empire was not sustained by military power alone. Its strength lay in its ability to build systems of administration, law, and bureaucracy that could operate across continents and cultures. These systems shaped economies, politics, and societies in ways that extended far beyond the lifetime of the empire itself. And perhaps that is one of the most intriguing aspects of this history. Empires may fall, borders may change, and flags may be lowered. But institutions, once established, can continue influencing societies for generations. So the question that remains is not only how the empire ruled such vast territories, but also how those systems transformed the world that followed. Because in many countries today, when a civil servant stamps an official document, when a judge interprets a legal code, or when a government office organizes public records, the quiet legacy of imperial administration is still at work, an echo of a time when governance itself became one of the empire's most powerful tools. The roar of a crowd can sometimes echo louder than the cannons of an empire. Across continents, from the bustling streets of Calcutta to the cocoa-rich towns of Ghana, from the fertile highlands of Kenya to the dense jungles of Malaya, ordinary people rose to confront extraordinary power. Imagine the sun rising over a quiet village in India in the 1920s. Smoke curls from clay ovens and children chase each other through narrow lanes. At first, the morning seems ordinary. Yet, beneath this calm, a network of whispers, secret meetings, and pamphlets spreads like wildfire. The locals are planning a strike against the British authorities, a small act of defiance that will ripple across districts. It is here, in the subtle stirrings of everyday life, that resistance begins. The British Empire, which boasted an unparalleled global reach, had underestimated one force it could never fully control: the human will to be free. Historical records show that British imperial control, while vast, was never absolute. By the early 20th century, India was home to nearly 300 million people under British rule. Yet, the rise of organized political movements, such as the Indian National Congress and later the civil disobedience campaigns led by Mahatma Gandhi, demonstrated that power could be challenged not only through violence but also through disciplined, coordinated nonviolent action. In 1919, the tragic massacre at Jallianwala Bagh shocked the entire subcontinent. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed or wounded as British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians. The horror ignited outrage and galvanized further resistance. People who had once worked quietly within the colonial system now began to demand change, recognizing that submission would only extend the empire's control. Across West Africa, the story was no less dramatic. The Gold Coast, rich in cocoa, timber, and minerals, had long served as a critical hub in Britain's global trade network. By the mid-20th century, a new generation of educated elites emerged, inspired both by local conditions and the broader wave of anti-colonial sentiment sweeping across the world. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah began to mobilize mass movements, drawing strength from striking workers, boycotting consumers, and rural communities frustrated with exploitation. It was in these very streets and villages that resistance took tangible shape, transforming abstract political ideals into actions that challenged imperial authority. The energy was contagious. Each strike, boycott, or demonstration, while local in scale, connected to a larger, invisible network of hope and determination. In East Africa, resistance often collided with extreme brutality. Kenya's fertile highlands had been claimed by European settlers, displacing the Kikuyu and other communities. By the 1950s, the frustration of dispossession and racial discrimination erupted into the Mau Mau uprising. Fighters, largely from disenfranchised communities, engaged in guerrilla warfare against the colonial administration. The British response was merciless. Villages were burned, populations displaced, and camps established where detainees endured forced labor, interrogation, and torture. Yet even in the darkest moments, the insurgents' resolve persisted. Their struggle was a testament to the human spirit's resistance against systems designed to dominate. Modern research and testimonies have revealed the scale of suffering endured during this period, highlighting both the courage of the resistance and the extremes of imperial repression. Meanwhile, in Malaya, the lush tropical jungles became arenas of covert conflict. Communist-led guerrilla fighters waged a sustained struggle against British authority in the post-World War II period, a conflict euphemistically termed the emergency. The dense foliage provided cover, allowing resistance forces to strike unexpectedly and vanish like ghosts, leaving imperial forces scrambling to adapt. Rubber plantations and tin mines, which had once symbolized British economic might, became sites of contestation and danger. The empire's dependence on industrial resources made Malaya a high-stakes environment where both economic imperatives and human determination clashed, shaping the trajectory of colonial governance and anti-colonial resistance alike. Resistance was rarely uniform. In India, some movements were grounded in nonviolent protest, while others involved direct confrontation with colonial authorities. In Africa, resistance could range from organized political agitation to armed insurrection. Yet across these disparate regions a pattern emerged. Colonized populations, though diverse in culture, language, and geography, consistently found ways to assert autonomy, challenge authority, and envision a future beyond imperial rule. This was not mere reactionary fury, it was strategic, often meticulously planned, and adaptive. Communities utilized both local knowledge and global awareness to exploit weaknesses in the colonial system. They understood that empires, for all their military and economic power, could not survive without the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the people they governed. Consider the personal story of a young cocoa farmer in Ghana during the 1940s. He had seen taxes rise, wages stagnate, and traditional farming practices disrupted by colonial policies favoring export crops for British markets. One day he joined a local boycott of cocoa exports, refusing to send his harvest to British-controlled trading houses. Initially, the action seemed insignificant, a small ripple against a vast ocean of power. But the ripple spread. Neighboring farmers, inspired by his courage, joined the boycott. Villages coordinated to resist price manipulations, creating pressure that reached colonial officials and British commercial interests. This microcosm illustrates a fundamental truth. Resistance often began with individuals and small communities, whose cumulative actions created undeniable momentum. The empire's own records, diaries, and intelligence reports reveal a persistent awareness of these pressures. British officials often described resistance as troublesome or unmanageable, reflecting the anxiety caused by movements that could not be easily crushed by conventional military might. In India, the repeated waves of protests, strikes, and civil disobedience forced the colonial government to negotiate, modify policies, and in some cases concede power incrementally. Across Africa and Southeast Asia, similar patterns emerged. Governments recognized that suppressing dissent with brute force alone was costly, unsustainable, and likely to provoke even greater resistance. Resistance movements also sparked a subtle psychological transformation among colonizers themselves. The British military and administrative elite were forced to reconsider assumptions about control, loyalty, and governance. They learned that empire relied not just on laws or armies but on managing perceptions, co-opting local elites, and mitigating unrest. Each strike, each boycott, each uprising became a puzzle to be solved, and in doing so highlighted the empire's vulnerabilities. But perhaps the most compelling element of these movements was the human creativity they revealed. From clandestine printing presses in Indian towns to secret meetings in Ghanaian villages, from covert supply lines in the Kenyan highlands to the hidden jungle camps of Malaya, resistance was as much about imagination as it was about courage. People devised ways to communicate, organize, and strategize that allowed them to remain a step ahead of imperial authorities. There was a quiet, almost invisible intelligence at work, a network of human ingenuity that challenged the assumption that empires were invincible. It is easy to forget that each act of resistance carried profound consequences. Beyond the immediate disruption of colonial policies, these movements shaped the consciousness of nations. They nurtured leadership, solidarity, and political acumen that would later guide struggles for independence. Figures like Gandhi, Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Malayan leaders were forged in the crucible of resistance, learning from both victory and setback. These movements connected local struggles to a global context, as activists and intellectuals drew inspiration from uprisings in distant lands, sharing strategies, ideas, and hope. The patterns of resistance also reveal a crucial insight into human societies. Power can never be exercised unilaterally for long. Economic might, military strength, and bureaucratic control can dominate temporarily, but the persistence of local knowledge, culture, and solidarity provides resilience. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, communities can assert their agency, shaping history from the ground up. As we trace these stories across continents and decades, a curious question emerges. How did small villages, jungles, and urban neighborhoods manage to influence global events? How did ordinary people, often with little access to formal power, force an empire to negotiate, adapt, and eventually retreat? The answer lies not in a single dramatic moment but in countless acts of persistence, courage, and ingenuity. Resistance was cumulative, strategic, and deeply human. By the 1960s, the impact of these movements was undeniable. India had achieved independence. Ghana followed, becoming the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule. Kenya and Malaya, after periods of intense struggle, moved toward self-governance. In each case, resistance was the engine that propelled change. It was never a straight path. There were setbacks, compromises, and conflicts. Yet the trajectory was clear. Empire could not endure against the collective will of the people it sought to dominate. And so, while the epic battles and negotiations of history may be recorded in textbooks, the essence of resistance lives in the quiet determination of everyday people. The farmers, workers, students, and villagers, whose courage reshaped entire nations. This story, of how ordinary lives intertwined with extraordinary ambition, comes to a pause here. The chapter of visible struggle closes softly, but the currents of resistance continue, flowing beneath the surface, connecting past and future, hinting at the deeper changes yet to unfold in the next story. The wind rustled through the tall grasses of the African highlands, carrying the distant rhythm of drums and the low murmur of secret meetings. In these hills, life seemed ordinary at first glance. Farmers tilled their land, children chased each other along narrow paths, and women carried water in clay pots, their laughter echoing across the valleys. Yet, beneath this ordinary surface, a quiet revolution was stirring. Villages communicated in coded songs, elders shared news under the veil of night, and young men and women secretly trained in the arts of protest and survival. The colonial authorities, with all their maps, soldiers, and administrative networks, had yet to grasp one fundamental truth. Resistance often thrived where they least expected it, in the quiet moments between dawn and dusk. In Kenya, for example, the fertile highlands were taken by European settlers, displacing generations of Kikuyu farmers. Land, labor, and identity were intertwined, and the loss was more than material. It cut at the very soul of communities. By the 1950s, the Mau Mau insurgency emerged as a direct response to this oppression. Fighters moved through the forests with intimate knowledge of terrain, using hidden trails and natural cover to outmaneuver patrols. For every village fenced and every camp established, another small group of insurgents reappeared, carrying the determination of a people who would not yield. Historical records indicate that thousands were detained, and many endured extreme conditions, yet these oppressive measures only reinforced the resolve of those fighting for dignity and self-determination. Meanwhile, in India, the echoes of civil disobedience traveled far beyond urban centers. The Salt March, led by Mahatma Gandhi, was not merely a protest against taxation but a symbolic act of reclaiming agency. Gandhi and his followers walked hundreds of miles along dusty paths, chanting, singing, and breaking colonial law through the simple act of collecting salt from the sea. Villages along the route joined spontaneously, forming a chain of defiance that could not be easily contained. The British government, despite its military might, struggled to suppress the movement without provoking widespread outrage. It became evident that collective, organized nonviolence could exert a pressure as potent as armed resistance. Across the Atlantic, the Gold Coast was transforming under a similar wave of consciousness. The cocoa trade, long controlled by British merchants, became a theater of resistance. Farmers refused to sell their produce at imposed prices, urban workers went on strike, and mass rallies brought together people from diverse backgrounds. The leadership of Kwame Nkrumah turned these grassroots movements into a coherent political strategy, demonstrating that economic leverage combined with mass mobilization could challenge imperial authority. These movements did not erupt overnight. They were cultivated through years of community organizing, education, and shared struggle, illustrating the patient, strategic nature of resistance. In Malaya, resistance took a different form. The post-World War II period saw communist-led guerrilla fighters retreat into jungles to wage a protracted campaign against British rule. Dense foliage and knowledge of local terrain gave them an advantage, allowing small groups to strike swiftly and disappear into the undergrowth. The British referred to this conflict as the emergency, deliberately avoiding the term war, but the stakes were immense. The empire's need to secure rubber and tin resources meant that economic imperatives and human defiance clashed with extraordinary intensity. Villages were relocated and policies attempted to divide communities, yet the guerrillas' determination persisted. The struggle revealed not only the physical challenges of resistance but also its psychological complexity, as fear, hope, and solidarity intertwined in unpredictable ways. What made these movements truly remarkable was the way ordinary lives became intertwined with extraordinary events. A woman in a Ghanaian village might secretly distribute leaflets while tending her fields. A young Indian student might skip classes to attend a clandestine meeting, risking arrest for the promise of a freer future. A Kikuyu farmer might hide supplies for Mau Mau fighters in plain sight, relying on subtle gestures and coded language. These everyday acts of courage, small in isolation, coalesced into a force that empires could neither fully anticipate nor fully suppress. The historian looking back sees strategy. The people living it felt only the urgency of survival and justice. Curiosity and mystery permeated these movements. How did resistance networks communicate across vast territories without detection? How did ideas of self-determination, developed thousands of miles away, inspire local action? Scholars suggest that newspapers, radio broadcasts, and personal letters helped spread knowledge, but oral traditions, songs, and folklore played equally crucial roles. Secrets were embedded in the familiar rhythms of daily life, in festivals, in market days, in songs sung under the cover of night. This invisible infrastructure of resistance allowed movements to grow quietly yet powerfully, like roots spreading beneath a forest floor, unseen but sustaining life above. Resistance also shaped governance and administrative decisions in subtle ways. British officials, realizing that overt repression could provoke backlash, increasingly sought compromise. Policies were adjusted, promises made, and reforms introduced, all designed to appease local populations without relinquishing core authority. Yet, the very need to negotiate highlighted the limits of imperial power. When a small, organized community could force concessions from the world's most powerful empire, it underscored a profound truth. Legitimacy arises not only from force but from consent, and consent could never be fully manufactured or imposed. In India, Ghana, Kenya, and Malaya, the consequences of resistance extended beyond immediate victories. Movements nurtured leaders, educated communities, and connected local struggles to a global network of anti-colonial activism. News of one victory inspired another. Leaders exchanged strategies, international attention pressured governments, and the moral authority of nonviolent protest created new possibilities. Each campaign, whether armed or peaceful, became a building block for independence, illustrating the cumulative power of organized human effort. By the early 1960s, the results were tangible. India had gained independence. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to break free from colonial rule. Kenya and Malaya moved steadily towards self-governance. Resistance had transformed not only political boundaries but also the consciousness of people and nations. It demonstrated that empires, no matter how vast, were ultimately fragile in the face of persistent, coordinated human agency. And yet, even as territories transitioned toward independence, the story of resistance did not end. It evolved, leaving subtle currents beneath the surface, influencing new generations and shaping the political landscape for decades to come. The sun sets over a quiet village in Malaya. Children play near a stream, farmers rest from a day's work, and the distant mountains catch the last light of evening. The visible struggles of the past fade, but the lessons remain, whispering through the fields, the forests, and the streets. The story pauses here, leaving space for reflection. Yet the link between human courage and historical change is never broken. It lingers, hinting at the chapters yet to unfold in the final arcs of resistance, negotiation, and independence. As dawn breaks over the Indian subcontinent, the mist rises from rice paddies and small villages, giving the landscape a ghostly shimmer. It is a land of immense diversity, yet beneath its patchwork of mountains, rivers, and fields, a single force pulses quietly but insistently: the demand for freedom. In towns and cities, in the courts of small rulers and the offices of colonial administrators, the echoes of discontent grow louder. The salt of the coastal waters and the labor in inland factories are no longer just commodities for an empire. They are symbols of a people's claim to agency, dignity, and self-determination. The story of resistance here is not merely one of marches and speeches. It is woven into daily life. Consider the city of Bombay, where factory workers labored for long hours under oppressive conditions. They organized strikes that halted production, defied curfews, and demanded wages and rights that the colonial economy had long denied them. Historical records suggest that thousands participated, risking arrest and violence, yet their efforts rippled outward, inspiring similar movements in Calcutta, Madras, and countless smaller towns. These were not isolated acts. They were part of a coordinated, strategic push against an empire that depended heavily on the labor of its subjects to maintain wealth and influence. Meanwhile, in West Africa, the struggle took on a distinctly political and social character. In the Gold Coast, educated elites, urban organizers, and rural communities converged in a movement for self-government. The leadership of Kwame Nkrumah guided this mass mobilization, turning widespread frustration into a coherent political campaign. Farmers refused to sell cocoa under unfair terms, and urban workers struck with precision, disrupting the colonial economy in ways that could not be ignored. Every protest, every rally, every act of civil disobedience carried a dual purpose: to challenge British authority and to cultivate a sense of collective identity. It was a slow, persistent form of revolution that relied as much on moral authority and strategic thinking as it did on numbers and momentum. Across the Indian Ocean and Malaya, resistance combined with survival. The dense jungles became the theater for a struggle between colonial forces and guerrilla fighters who refused to accept foreign domination. Villagers were caught between these forces, their homes and livelihoods disrupted. Yet many became active participants, providing shelter, supplies, and intelligence to those resisting imperial control. The British called it the emergency, but for those living it, the conflict was total: physical, psychological, and emotional. Historical studies reveal the remarkable adaptability of local resistance. Networks operated in secrecy, communication relied on oral codes, and families carried forward a silent form of defiance that intertwined everyday life with the broader struggle for autonomy. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising represents another layer of complexity in resistance. It was not a single movement but a constellation of localized efforts unified by shared grievances: land alienation, racial discrimination, and the legacy of forced labor. Kikuyu communities organized clandestine meetings in forests, coordinated supply chains for fighters, and educated the next generation in the principles of independence. The colonial administration responded with mass detentions, camps, and military operations, yet the insurgency persisted. Scholars have since argued that the resilience of the Mau Mau movement stemmed not only from tactical skill but from a deep-rooted sense of identity and justice, values that could not be captured on paper, surveyed on a map, or defeated by sheer force. Resistance was equally about symbolism and communication. In India, a simple act such as breaking salt laws, refusing to carry British-issued identity documents, or holding a silent vigil in the town square could resonate far beyond the immediate locale. In West Africa, striking cocoa farmers demonstrated that economic leverage was as powerful as armed conflict. Across Malaya and Kenya, clandestine movements relied on cultural knowledge and storytelling to sustain morale. Oral histories, songs, and poetry encoded messages, creating an invisible infrastructure of defiance. Even under extreme surveillance, these networks thrived, reminding the world that human ingenuity in the face of oppression can be relentless. Curiosity about these movements reveals deeper truths. How did ordinary people, often lacking formal education or resources, create such sophisticated forms of resistance? How did strategy spread across continents and cultures? The answer lies in the universal human instincts for survival, justice, and dignity. Resistance was not only an intellectual exercise, it was emotional, visceral, and deeply personal. Every family that hid supplies, every teacher who educated children in secret, every activist who risked arrest, contributed to an ecosystem of defiance. These stories often go untold in official narratives, yet they are the backbone of every movement, illustrating the extraordinary potential of ordinary individuals when faced with systemic oppression. In the Caribbean, although geographically distant from the centers of imperial power, resistance still played a crucial role. Sugar plantations, long operated under brutal conditions, became sites of subtle and overt defiance. Workers sabotaged machinery, organized slowdowns, and used the rhythms of daily labor as opportunities to communicate and strategize. These acts might seem small, yet collectively they disrupted production and signaled to colonial authorities that domination was never absolute. Resistance in every corner of the empire was multidimensional, blending economics, culture, politics, and morality into a persistent challenge to imperial authority. Historical data underscores the scope and impact of these movements. By the 1950s and 1960s, British colonial governance was no longer tenable in the face of organized opposition. Independence movements succeeded because they combined grassroots participation, moral authority, international attention, and persistent local action. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah became symbols, but the true power lay in millions of ordinary people, the farmers, laborers, students, and families, who sustained resistance over years, often at great personal risk. This interconnectedness created a ripple effect. News of protests and victories traveled across continents, inspiring other populations under colonial rule. Movements in Africa drew inspiration from India, just as Caribbean communities looked to West Africa for strategies. The moral weight of resistance movements, amplified by global media and emerging international organizations, pressured imperial powers to negotiate, reform, and eventually withdraw. Resistance reshaped the political, social, and economic landscapes of entire regions, setting the stage for the decolonization process that would define the mid-20th century. As the sun dips below the horizon over a West African village, children play by a river once used to transport cocoa. The laughter mingles with the whispers of history, stories of strikes, secret meetings, marches, and uprisings. The visible scars of colonial rule may fade, but the invisible currents of resistance remain, carried in memory, culture, and the institutions that emerged from these struggles. The story pauses here, leaving room for reflection and anticipation, suggesting that the journey of resilience, strategy, and hope continues beyond what is visible, connecting past struggles to the generations still shaping their nations. The sky over London in the early morning of 1918 was a muted gray, as if the heavens themselves were weighed down by the smoke and sorrow of a world at war. Pause. The streets, once bustling with commerce and chatter, now echoed with the footsteps of men leaving for the front and the quiet sobs of those left behind. Britain, the proud imperial power, had mobilized millions, sending them to battlefields stretching from the muddy trenches of France to the deserts of Mesopotamia. The cost was staggering, not just in lives but in the very soul of the nation. The First World War had left Britain exhausted, its economy strained, its coffers depleted, and its confidence shaken. For the first time, many began to question whether the maintenance of far-flung colonies was a sustainable dream or a fading illusion. Across the globe, in the colonies themselves, the impact was equally profound. Indian soldiers fought bravely in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, carrying the Union Jack over unfamiliar lands, while back home, their families struggled under the burden of war taxes and food shortages. In Africa, men conscripted from West and East African territories labored under military and logistical demands far from home. These contributions, heroic though they were, sowed the seeds of political awareness. People who had fought for Britain began to demand recognition, rights, and ultimately self-determination. The paradox was clear. Colonies were expected to support the imperial center, yet the very experience of war empowered them to envision independence. As the Second Global Conflict erupted 2 decades later, the strain intensified. Britain emerged victorious in 1945, yet it was a nation exhausted beyond measure. The Royal Navy, once the uncontested master of the seas, had suffered losses, and the army was stretched thin. Economically, the country was in ruin. Cities leveled by aerial bombardment, infrastructure in disrepair, industries fatigued by years of wartime production. The United States had become the new financial hegemon, lending Britain money, equipment, and expertise. Britain's reliance on American support was a stark reminder that its days as a self-sufficient global power were waning. For many, this dependence illuminated an uncomfortable truth. The empire, once thought invincible, was now vulnerable. One vivid illustration of this vulnerability can be found in the story of Burma. During the Second World War, Japanese forces advanced rapidly, displacing British administrators and soldiers. Local populations, initially under British protection, faced the turmoil of occupation, forced migration, and intense hardship. The British administration's inability to maintain control in such circumstances demonstrated that their global reach had limits, and the illusion of omnipotence was fading fast. Similar patterns emerged across Malaya, Nigeria, and the Caribbean, regions where economic extraction had long been the empire's priority. The wars disrupted trade, depleted resources, and revealed that colonial rule was becoming increasingly unsustainable. But it was not just the colonies that felt the strain. In Britain, social and political change accelerated as returning soldiers demanded a fairer society. Women, who had filled factories and offices during the wars, pushed for rights and representation. Unions became more assertive, strikes more common, and political discourse shifted toward welfare, equity, and reconstruction. This domestic unrest, paired with the economic impossibility of sustaining costly overseas governance, made the maintenance of the empire increasingly impractical. It became clear that the old model, extracting resources, enforcing control, and maintaining military dominance, could no longer function without incurring unacceptable social, financial, and moral costs. In the Caribbean, although geographically distant from the centers of imperial power, resistance still played a crucial role. Sugar plantations, long operated under brutal conditions, became sites of subtle and overt defiance. Workers sabotaged machinery, organized slowdowns, and used the rhythms of daily labor as opportunities to communicate and strategize. These acts might seem small, yet collectively they disrupted production and signaled to colonial authorities that domination was never absolute. Resistance, in every corner of the empire, was multidimensional, blending economics, culture, politics, and morality into a persistent challenge to imperial authority. Historical data underscores the scope and impact of these movements. By the 1950s and 1960s, British colonial governance was no longer tenable in the face of organized opposition. Independence movements succeeded because they combined grassroots participation, moral authority, international attention, and persistent local action. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Kwame Nkrumah became symbols, but the true power lay in millions of ordinary people, the farmers, laborers, students, and families, who sustained resistance over years, often at great personal risk. This interconnectedness created a ripple effect. News of protests and victories traveled across continents, inspiring other populations under colonial rule. Movements in Africa drew inspiration from India, just as Caribbean communities looked to West Africa for strategies. The moral weight of resistance movements, amplified by global media and emerging international organizations, pressured imperial powers to negotiate, reform, and eventually withdraw. Resistance reshaped the political, social, and economic landscapes of entire regions, setting the stage for the decolonization process that would define the mid-20th century. As the sun dips below the horizon over a West African village, children play by a river once used to transport cocoa. The laughter mingles with the whispers of history, stories of strikes, secret meetings, marches, and uprisings. The visible scars of colonial rule may fade, but the invisible currents of resistance remain, carried in memory, culture, and the institutions that emerged from these struggles. The story pauses here, leaving room for reflection and anticipation, suggesting that the journey of resilience, strategy, and hope continues beyond what is visible, connecting past struggles to the generations still shaping their nations. The sky over London in the early morning of 1918 was a muted gray, as if the heavens themselves were weighed down by the smoke and sorrow of a world at war. Pause. The streets, once bustling with commerce and chatter, now echoed with the footsteps of men leaving for the front and the quiet sobs of those left behind. Britain, the proud imperial power, had mobilized millions, sending them to battlefields stretching from the muddy trenches of France to the deserts of Mesopotamia. The cost was staggering, not just in lives but in the very soul of the nation. The First World War had left Britain exhausted, its economy strained, its coffers depleted, and its confidence shaken. For the first time, many began to question whether the maintenance of far-flung colonies was a sustainable dream or a fading illusion. Across the globe, in the colonies themselves, the impact was equally profound. Indian soldiers fought bravely in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, carrying the Union Jack over unfamiliar lands, while back home, their families struggled under the burden of war taxes and food shortages. In Africa, Men conscripted from West and East African territories labored under military and logistical demands far from home. These contributions, heroic though they were, sowed the seeds of political awareness. People who had fought for Britain began to demand recognition, rights, and ultimately self-determination. The paradox was clear. Colonies were expected to support the imperial center, yet the very experience of war empowered them to envision independence. As the Second Global Conflict erupted 2 decades later, the strain intensified. Britain emerged victorious in 1945, yet it was a nation exhausted beyond measure. The Royal Navy, once the uncontested master of the seas, had suffered losses, and the army was stretched thin. Economically, the country was in ruin. Cities leveled by aerial bombardment, infrastructure in disrepair, industries fatigued by years of wartime production. The United States had become the new financial hegemon, lending Britain money, equipment, and expertise. Britain's reliance on American support was a stark reminder that its days as a self-sufficient global power were waning. For many, this dependence illuminated an uncomfortable truth. The empire, once thought invincible, was now vulnerable. One vivid illustration of this vulnerability can be found in the story of Burma. During the Second World War, Japanese forces advanced rapidly, displacing British administrators and soldiers. Local populations, initially under British protection, faced the turmoil of occupation, forced migration, and intense hardship. The British administration's inability to maintain control in such circumstances demonstrated that their global reach had limits, and the illusion of omnipotence was fading fast. Similar patterns emerged across Malaya, Nigeria, and the Caribbean, regions where economic extraction had long been the empire's priority. The wars disrupted trade, depleted resources, and revealed that colonial rule was becoming increasingly unsustainable. But it was not just the colonies that felt the strain. In Britain, social and political change accelerated as returning soldiers demanded a fairer society. Women, who had filled factories and offices during the wars, pushed for rights and representation. Unions became more assertive, strikes more common, and political discourse shifted toward welfare, equity, and reconstruction. This domestic unrest, paired with the economic impossibility of sustaining costly overseas governance, made the maintenance of the empire increasingly impractical. It became clear that the old model, extracting resources, enforcing control, and maintaining military dominance, could no longer function without incurring unacceptable social, financial, and moral costs. Across the Indian Ocean, the movement of goods and people reflected a delicate balance of exploitation and adaptation. Steamships hummed across trade routes, carrying cotton, tea, rubber, and minerals back to Britain. Naval convoys, once symbols of power and intimidation, also enabled communities and colonies to experience a connectedness that was previously unimaginable. Letters crossed continents in weeks instead of months, and small traders in Malaya or the Caribbean could witness the rhythms of global markets through telegraphs and shipping reports. But this connection was double-edged. While trade promised opportunity, it was built upon asymmetry. Profit flowed upward, often leaving local producers with only subsistence. The story of a rubber tapper's village in Malaya exemplified this. Families worked in exhausting conditions, yet the wealth of the empire was measured in pounds and pence hundreds of miles away in London offices, oblivious to the human toil that made them possible. The world wars that erupted in 1914 and again in 1939 further exposed these vulnerabilities. Britain's military focus pulled men from colonies into global conflict, and the human cost of distant battles reverberated across towns, farms, and port cities. Soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean were conscripted into theaters of war far from home, carrying with them not only their courage but also a growing awareness of their collective power. In the trenches of Europe and the deserts of North Africa, they saw the limits of British invincibility. Letters home told stories of bravery and suffering alike, stirring nationalist sentiments among families and local leaders. These experiences, often underappreciated in imperial records, laid the groundwork for political awakening. Ordinary lives intersected with the extraordinary forces of history, illustrating both the human cost and the inevitability of change. By the late 1940s, economic strain became undeniable. Britain emerged from World War II with depleted coffers, war debt, and a populace weary of sacrifice. Maintaining colonies across distant continents was no longer justifiable purely in terms of prestige or strategic control. The Suez Crisis of 1956 symbolized this harsh reality. A global audience watched as Britain's attempts to assert imperial authority clashed with rising American influence, the United Nations' moral authority, and a world increasingly conscious of self-determination. Colonies, too, sensed this vulnerability. Across Africa and Asia, local movements shifted from passive petitioning to active organizing. Grassroots leaders, intellectuals, and ex-servicemen turned their wartime experiences into political capital, demanding representation, autonomy, and ultimately independence. In West Africa, Ghana's struggle under Kwame Nkrumah epitomized this shift. Cocoa farmers and city dwellers alike mobilized, blending strikes, boycotts, and political education to challenge colonial structures. Each victory, no matter how incremental, illuminated the fragility of imperial authority and inspired movements in neighboring territories. Similarly, in Malaya, rubber plantation workers and tin miners witnessed not just the physical machinery of empire but also the human machinery, the networks of labor, compliance, and resistance, that sustained it. Guerrilla movements, political unions, and local councils began to emerge, navigating the delicate balance between negotiation and confrontation. East Africa's narrative was often darker but equally instructive. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising demonstrated the explosive consequences of sustained inequality, land alienation, and political exclusion. Villages became battlegrounds both physically and ideologically. Families were torn apart, yet amidst the violence, the drive for dignity and self-governance endured. Colonial records attempted to downplay the extent of resistance, but oral histories, personal diaries, and later testimonies revealed a profound truth. Empire relied not just on armies or legislation, but on human acquiescence. Once that acquiescence was shaken, the structures of authority began to crumble. By the early 1960s, the pattern was unmistakable. Colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean began to achieve independence. Nigeria in 1960, Ghana in 1957, and the Federation of Malaya in 1957 represented not isolated events but milestones in a global process. Each transition was unique, shaped by local cultures, economic dependencies, and historical contingencies, yet all bore the unmistakable imprint of imperial overreach and local resilience. The world witnessed a transformation not through a single decisive battle but through a complex interplay of human agency, geopolitical pressures, and economic realities. And yet, the British Empire's influence did not vanish overnight. The Commonwealth emerged as a novel framework for cooperation, blending voluntary association with shared histories. Legal systems, educational institutions, and trade networks persisted, repurposed by independent nations for their own ends. Even as the Union Jack was lowered, the invisible threads of governance, commerce, and culture continued to shape daily life in London, Accra, Kuala Lumpur, Nairobi, and beyond. Railways still carried goods and people. Courtrooms still followed procedures that traced back to Westminster. Universities produced new generations of leaders fluent in the language and structure of their former rulers. As this chapter of history softly concludes, one sees not only the collapse of formal colonial rule but also the enduring human narratives woven through centuries of expansion, exploitation, governance, and resistance. From the cocoa farms of West Africa to the tin mines of Malaya, from the streets of colonial Nairobi to the ports of India, ordinary lives intersected with imperial ambitions in ways that transformed both the colonies and the metropole. The story of global expansion, human courage, and systemic transformation is complete for this shooting point, yet the threads remain unbroken, leading us seamlessly into the broader tapestry of decolonization, post-imperial societies, and the continuing echoes of empire in the modern world. The world that emerged from the smoke and rubble of the Second World War was a landscape transformed in ways few could have predicted. Cities across Europe lay in ruins, economies were strained, and empires that once stretched across oceans and continents found themselves vulnerable, financially exhausted, and politically challenged. The British Empire, which had long prided itself on its reach and influence, suddenly faced the stark reality that maintaining distant colonies was no longer sustainable. Soldiers who had fought in faraway lands returned home, bearing stories of courage and horror, and with them came the knowledge that the world was changing. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the people who had endured decades of colonial rule sensed that the tide had turned. In the streets of Accra, young men and women gathered in town halls and marketplaces, debating, organizing, and mobilizing. They were inspired not just by their own hardships under colonial policies but also by global shifts that emphasized self-determination and human rights. Kwame Nkrumah, a charismatic leader emerging from this ferment, understood that independence was not a distant dream but a feasible goal. Through political pressure, organized strikes, and carefully negotiated settlements, the Gold Coast steadily moved toward sovereignty. By 1957, it became the independent nation of Ghana, a milestone not only for its own people but also as a beacon to neighboring territories still under colonial rule. Meanwhile, in Asia, the situation was equally complex. The Federation of Malaya had witnessed years of Japanese occupation during World War II, which shattered myths of invincibility and colonial omnipotence. Post-war, communist-led guerrilla movements challenged British authority in the jungles, while civil leaders engaged in negotiations and political reforms aimed at securing self-government. The British realized that a purely military approach would be costly and ultimately futile. By 1957, Malaya achieved independence through a blend of negotiation, compromise, and strategic planning, a delicate balance between the demands of nationalists and the imperatives of a withdrawing imperial power. East Africa, however, told a more turbulent story. In Kenya, grievances over land dispossession, labor exploitation, and racial discrimination had been building for decades. The Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s erupted as a direct response, drawing many fighters from dispossessed Kikuyu communities. What followed was a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, involving detentions, forced labor, and collective punishments. Villages were fenced, populations moved, and both guerrillas and colonial forces committed acts of violence. Despite the severity of the crackdown, the uprising demonstrated the untenable nature of British rule. By the early 1960s, independence was inevitable, and in 1963, Kenya formally gained sovereignty. The story of struggle and resilience was not just a tale of conflict. It was a testament to the power of organized, persistent resistance in shaping history. In Nigeria, the path to independence followed a somewhat different trajectory, emphasizing constitutional negotiation and the gradual transfer of power. By 1960, Nigeria became independent, but internal divisions along ethnic, regional, and religious lines would soon present new challenges. Across the world, each colony's journey was distinct, shaped by local histories, cultural dynamics, and political strategies. Yet the broader pattern was clear. Post-war decolonization was a global wave propelled by both the weakening of imperial powers and the determined efforts of colonized peoples. The global context amplified these local struggles. The United Nations, with its emphasis on human rights and self-determination, provided a platform for colonial leaders to speak to an international audience. The United States and the Soviet Union, for strategic reasons, encouraged decolonization while seeking to influence the ideological direction of newly independent states. Former colonies were no longer isolated, they were part of a worldwide movement that redefined sovereignty, governance, and identity. By the 1970s, the map of the world had been redrawn. Countries across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean had achieved independence, yet the legacies of empire lingered. Administrative structures, legal frameworks, trade networks, and educational institutions established during colonial rule persisted, often adapted to serve the needs of new nations. Languages, currencies, and transportation systems carried echoes of imperial design, reminding citizens that while political control had shifted, historical influence remained woven into the fabric of daily life. As this chapter of history gently concludes, one sees not only the end of formal colonial rule but also the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of the peoples who navigated this transformative period. The story of post-war decolonization is not a tale of abrupt change. It is a complex, layered narrative of negotiation, struggle, adaptation, and hope. The threads of empire did not snap. They were reconfigured, reshaped by those who had lived under them, and in doing so, laid the foundation for the modern nations we see today. The journey for freedom and self-determination had reached a milestone, yet the connections, challenges, and legacies of this era continued, subtly linking the past to the unfolding present. It was the summer of 1956, and the world watched as one of the most crucial waterways connecting Europe to the riches of Asia and Africa became the epicenter of an international crisis. The Suez Canal, a lifeline of trade that had shaped centuries of empires and commerce, suddenly symbolized the waning power of Britain on the global stage. In London, government officials pored over maps and reports, realizing that the strategic jewel they had long taken for granted was no longer solely within their control. Across the Mediterranean in Egypt, crowds gathered along the canal, waving flags and cheering as President Gamal Abdel Nasser declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The message was clear: Britain's imperial grip was being challenged, not by distant rebels in the colonies, but by a sovereign nation asserting its authority on the international stage. Ships laden with oil, military supplies, and commercial goods sat at the entrances of the canal, waiting. The air was thick with tension and uncertainty. London, Paris, and Tel Aviv engaged in secret consultations, plotting a swift intervention. Britain, France, and Israel planned a military response intended to regain control of the canal and, symbolically, Britain's diminishing influence. But beneath the surface, the geopolitical currents had shifted dramatically. The United States, emerging from the devastation of World War II as the primary global superpower, demanded to be consulted and insisted on a restraint that London and Paris had not anticipated. The Soviet Union, simultaneously, issued stern warnings, threatening escalation. The world had changed, and Britain's old confidence in unilateral action was no longer valid. On the ground, the unfolding events were chaotic and gripping. Israeli forces moved quickly into the Sinai Peninsula, followed closely by paratroopers from Britain and France, aiming to stabilize the region and secure the canal. Egyptian forces resisted, international diplomats scrambled, and the media broadcast images of tanks and explosions into living rooms around the globe. Ordinary citizens in Britain and France watched in disbelief, witnessing the limits of their nation's power laid bare before their eyes. Journalists on the scene captured not just the military maneuvers, but the human stories, the fear, confusion, and resolve of people caught between old imperial ambitions and new national assertiveness. The Suez Crisis revealed more than just military logistics. It exposed a profound shift in global politics. Britain had long relied on colonies, trade networks, and naval supremacy to project influence, but now it faced an economic reality in which independent superpowers, nuclear capabilities, and international financial pressures constrained its options. The British pound wavered on global markets, and the government felt the sting of economic vulnerability. Political leaders recognized that attempts to reassert imperial control in the old style risked alienating not just local populations, but the broader international community. The crisis had a psychological dimension as well, shaking national pride and exposing the stark contrast between the image of empire and the New World Order. Amidst this tension, the international response was swift and decisive. The United States applied financial pressure, threatening the stability of the British economy if the intervention continued. The United Nations condemned the actions, framing the crisis as a test of post-war international norms. London and Paris, confronted with this unprecedented combination of economic, diplomatic, and political resistance, had no choice but to withdraw their forces. The operation, intended as a show of imperial resolve, instead became a humiliation that underscored Britain's declining autonomy on the global stage. For historians, the Suez Crisis is often cited as a turning point, marking the definitive end of Britain's role as a dominant, independent imperial power. Yet the story is also one of subtlety and human experience. On the streets of Cairo, ordinary Egyptians celebrated their country's assertion of sovereignty, while British diplomats and citizens grappled with a profound sense of loss and re-evaluation. The crisis demonstrated that control over territory, trade routes, and military might was no longer sufficient to maintain influence. Legitimacy, international recognition, and economic resilience had become equally vital. The aftermath of Suez had lasting consequences. Politically, Britain accelerated plans to decolonize, acknowledging that maintaining distant territories without international backing or domestic economic stability was unsustainable. Militarily, the nation reassessed the role of its navy and global deployments, understanding that strategic overreach could no longer be tolerated. Economically, the crisis highlighted vulnerabilities that demanded reform and reliance on new alliances. And culturally, it forced a nation to confront the reality that the age of empire, as it had been imagined for centuries, was giving way to a world defined by independence, diplomacy, and interdependence. Yet, even as the Suez Crisis concluded, it did not sever the threads of connection entirely. Britain remained engaged in global affairs, its influence now channeled through international organizations, trade partnerships, and evolving relationships with former colonies. The lesson of Suez was clear. Imperial ambition without adaptation, consultation, and awareness of a changing world order was no longer viable. The episode became a story of caution, resilience, and transition, a narrative that foreshadowed the final decades of post-war decolonization, linking the past struggles of empire to the realities of modern statehood and global diplomacy. As the dust settled along the banks of the canal, as ships resumed their cautious passage, and as diplomats returned to their offices in London, Paris, and Cairo, the world had witnessed a profound shift. The British flag remained in distant corners of the globe, yet the illusion of unchallenged power had been shattered. The Suez Crisis closed a chapter of overt imperial assertion, but the currents of influence, commerce, and cultural legacy would continue to ripple outward, quietly shaping international relations and the lives of millions across continents. The story of Suez ends here for now, yet the link to the broader saga of empire and decolonization flows on, waiting to be traced in the next chapter of history. Imagine stepping into a classroom in Mumbai, filled with students reciting lessons in English, or walking through the bustling streets of Lagos where English signage guides the flow of commerce. In Kingston, Jamaica, lawyers in powdered wigs navigate courtrooms following legal procedures that echo Westminster traditions. Across continents and oceans, the threads of an empire long dissolved continue to weave themselves into daily life. This is the cultural legacy of the British Empire, subtle, persistent, and pervasive, shaping language, education, law, and governance long after formal rule ended. It begins with language, perhaps the most visible marker of cultural inheritance. English, once the tongue of a small island nation, became the medium of administration, trade, and education across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. In schools from Delhi to Nairobi, students learn not only grammar and literature, but a worldview coded into the very structure of the language. Scientific terms, legal vocabulary, and bureaucratic expressions traveled along with textbooks and teachers, embedding themselves in societies far removed from London. English became both a tool of opportunity and a reminder of historical domination, a paradox that persists to this day. Education systems mirrored those of Britain, introducing structured curricula, standardized examinations, and professional training that sought to produce clerks, civil servants, and future leaders loyal to imperial structures. In Singapore, schools established in the early 20th century trained generations of administrators who would later run the independent state with remarkable efficiency. Yet these same institutions also produced thinkers, writers, and activists who would challenge colonial rule, proving that systems of control could inadvertently nurture the seeds of resistance. The story of education is one of complexity, a dual legacy of empowerment and imposed structure, of inherited knowledge and contested authority. Legal codes and governance models carried similar dualities. In Lagos and Cape Town, courtroom procedures, contract law, and administrative protocols were modeled on British precedents, providing continuity in civil society and commerce. The framework of parliamentary debate, civil service hierarchies, and local councils were exported as instruments of order and legitimacy. For many former colonies, these systems formed the backbone of post-independence governance, offering a familiar, functional structure on which to build new nations. Yet they also carried traces of the imperial mindset, privileging certain modes of decision-making and authority, a reminder that culture and power were intertwined. Consider the streets of Hong Kong in the 1980s, where English-language newspapers, public signage, and bilingual schools reflected the island's colonial past. Despite political changes and the impending handover to China, cultural practices established under British rule persisted. Similarly, in Caribbean nations such as Barbados and Jamaica, cricket grounds, parliamentary traditions, and even culinary influences, tea-time rituals, bread, and pastries, offer tangible evidence of the long reach of empire. These examples illustrate that cultural inheritance is not merely abstract. It is lived, consumed, and performed, influencing generations in ways both subtle and profound. The human element makes this legacy vivid. Imagine a family in Nairobi debating civic issues in English, using legal terminology inherited from a colonial education. Picture a student in Kolkata preparing for civil service exams that trace their lineage to British administrative training. Listen to the rhythms of daily life in Toronto or Sydney, where architecture, governance, and even social rituals echo practices imported centuries ago. Each story underscores the complex interplay of adoption, adaptation, and resistance, revealing how culture moves across time and space, often in unexpected ways. Why does this matter? Because culture, unlike borders or armies, endures silently. It shapes thought, informs communication, and provides a lens through which societies interpret the world. The British Empire, for all its conquest and control, left behind structures that outlived military dominance. Language became a bridge linking continents, legal systems offered continuity in governance, and educational models produced both collaborators and critics. The mystery lies in this duality. The same tools used to administer an empire became instruments of local empowerment, intellectual growth, and global connection. Yet curiosity persists. How much of what we see in former colonies today is a result of deliberate design, and how much is the emergent product of local adaptation? In India, English remains a lingua franca bridging hundreds of regional languages. In Kenya, civil service protocols balance local needs with inherited procedures. In Singapore, a hybrid legal and educational system reflects both local initiative and historical inheritance. Across these examples, one finds a layered story of influence, negotiation, and transformation, a narrative that invites deeper exploration. The story of cultural legacy is also a story of endurance. Even as flags changed and political power shifted, the echoes of empire reverberated through institutions, rituals, and social norms. Cricket matches in the Caribbean, courtroom debates in Nairobi, and university lectures in Melbourne carry with them centuries of shared history, sometimes embraced, sometimes contested, but always present. The legacy is neither purely positive nor entirely negative. It is a complex inheritance, a living testament to a past that continues to shape the present. As we walk through cities shaped by colonial legacies, attend schools influenced by imperial curricula, or listen to languages forged by centuries of contact, we are witnessing history in motion. Cultural connections stretch invisibly across continents, binding people through shared systems, practices, and ideas. Yet they also carry the shadows of exploitation, hierarchy, and control, reminding us that every inherited system has its story, its cost, and its contradictions. The narrative of cultural legacy softly concludes here for now, but the threads remain unbroken. From language to law, from classrooms to courts, from cricket fields to streets lined with colonial architecture, the story continues. These connections, inherited and transformed, invite reflection, debate, and discovery. They form the silent, enduring afterimage of empire, a living history that is all around us, quietly linking past and present, and shaping the contours of life in ways we may only begin to understand. Picture the bustling ports of Mumbai and Kolkata in the 19th century, the clamor of sailors unloading crates of cotton, spices, and tea. Ships with towering masts bristled against the horizon, their hulls laden with the raw materials of a continent transformed into a network of global commerce. The British Empire, at its zenith, was more than a collection of colonies. It was a meticulously orchestrated economic machine. Through trade networks, ports, and financial institutions, the empire wove a lattice that connected Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, shaping the very arteries of global commerce in ways that still echo today. The story begins with trade routes that crisscrossed oceans. From the Bay of Bengal to the shores of West Africa, ships carried goods not only for profit but for strategic control. Tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, gold from Africa, and textiles from the Indian subcontinent moved through ports designed and fortified by the British to ensure efficiency, safety, and dominance. These ports, Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town, and Singapore, were more than mere harbors. They were hubs of economic power, centers where imperial interests met local labor, and spaces where global commerce was orchestrated with precision. Consider the experience of a dock worker in Bombay in the 1870s. Each morning, he would see towering masts of ships arriving from Africa or the Caribbean, laden with goods destined for London. His hands, rough from loading crates of jute and cotton, connected him directly to the global economy, even if he never left the docks. The empire's economic machine relied on millions of such individual stories, human cogs in an industrial and commercial mechanism that reached across continents. This human element reminds us that economic systems are lived experiences, not abstractions. The financial infrastructure supporting these trade networks was equally crucial. The East India Company and later British banks and colonies established systems of credit, currency, and accounting that enabled trade at a scale never before seen. London became the hub of a worldwide financial network, while colonial banks facilitated transactions, issued notes, and managed reserves in ways that mirrored metropolitan practices. Cities like Hong Kong and Singapore emerged as financial powerhouses precisely because of the foundations laid during the colonial period. These institutions did not simply vanish at the end of empire. They evolved, adapted, and continued to influence contemporary global finance. Trade under empire also created dependencies that reshaped local economies. In Africa, the demand for cash crops like cocoa and palm oil transformed subsistence farming into production for export. Indian textiles, once self-sufficient and thriving locally, were reoriented to supply British industrial demands. These shifts had profound consequences. Wealth flowed to the metropole, infrastructure favored export rather than local needs, and labor patterns were reorganized to serve global markets. Yet, in the process, new skills, logistical expertise, and administrative know-how spread among local populations, planting seeds for modern economic activity. Imagine the bustling docks of Freetown in Sierra Leone, where traders negotiated the prices of palm oil and diamonds. The same economic principles echoed in Kingston's sugar plantations, Calcutta's jute mills, and Singapore's trading posts. Each locale participated in a vast network that balanced profit, strategy, and human labor. Scientific studies of trade patterns show that many former colonial ports remain among the busiest in the world, reflecting the enduring influence of routes and infrastructures established centuries ago. The mystery lies in how local adaptations of these systems created unique economic landscapes, places where global influence was absorbed and transformed by local ingenuity. Stories of individual traders and entrepreneurs further illuminate this legacy. Take, for example, an Indian merchant in the 1920s who navigated colonial bureaucracy to export spices to Europe. He mastered the financial codes, adapted to shipping schedules, and built relationships across continents. His success depended on the infrastructure left by the empire, yet his innovation demonstrates that colonial systems were not simply imposed. They were engaged with, contested, and expanded by local actors. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, countless similar stories unfolded, illustrating the interplay between imperial structures and local agency. Economic legacies extend beyond trade to migration and labor. The movement of people, indentured laborers from India to the Caribbean, African workers to plantations, and Chinese laborers to Southeast Asia, was facilitated by the very trade networks and ports the empire established. These migrations reshaped demographics, cultures, and economic dependencies across the world. Cities like Port of Spain, Durban, and Penang became multicultural economic hubs, their diversity a living testament to centuries-old trade connections. Why does this matter today? Because the systems established during the British Empire continue to shape global commerce. Modern supply chains, financial markets, and trade agreements trace their roots back to colonial-era routes and institutions. The London Stock Exchange, historically connected to colonial trade, still functions as a global hub. Shipping routes laid down in the 18th and 19th centuries remain vital arteries of international trade. Economic power, although redistributed and transformed, is still partially structured by patterns established under empire. Curiosity persists. How much of today's economic interconnectedness is a direct inheritance from empire, and how much is the product of local adaptation and global evolution? When examining ports in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, one sees a layering of history and modernity. Old warehouses coexist with container terminals. Colonial-era trading companies have become multinational corporations. The echoes of imperial strategy resonate in the patterns of commerce, investment, and migration that define the global economy today. The story of economic legacies is also a story of resilience and transformation. Colonies once molded to serve distant interests developed the capacity to engage globally on their own terms. Former ports now handle trade independently, former financial institutions now operate in sovereign economies, and formerly colonized nations have built their own networks of commerce. Yet, the fingerprints of empire remain, shaping possibilities, influencing decisions, and connecting local economies to global trends. As we follow the shipping lanes, examine bustling ports, and consider the flow of goods, we are tracing history in motion. Economic structures that began under imperial rule continue to guide trade, investment, and migration, highlighting the enduring impact of the British Empire. This legacy, complex and layered, invites reflection on the past, recognition of local agency, and understanding of the global patterns that define the modern world. And so, the story softly concludes here, not as an end but as a pause. The networks, ports, and financial systems persist, alive in the arteries of global commerce, waiting for us to trace their paths, to understand their origins, and to witness how the echoes of empire continue to shape the world today. The morning sun rises over the plains of Kenya, casting long shadows across a landscape that once witnessed the forced removal of communities to make way for British settler farms. Children walk past remnants of old railways and colonial administrative buildings, unaware of the human struggles that shaped their surroundings. This is the story of uneven development, of an empire that promised progress to some while imposing dispossession, forced labor, and economic inequality on others. It is a story where the gleam of infrastructure and institutions is inseparably entwined with the shadows of coercion and exploitation. In India, the construction of railways is often celebrated as a symbol of progress, linking distant cities and facilitating trade. Yet, beneath the iron tracks lay stories of hardship and exploitation. Thousands of laborers, often recruited under coercive conditions, faced brutal working environments, disease, and malnutrition. These railways were not built solely for local benefit. They were arteries of the empire designed to extract raw materials and move troops, enabling Britain to consolidate economic and military control. The promise of modernity came at a staggering human cost, one that is often hidden behind the grandeur of colonial achievements. Consider the Caribbean sugar plantations, where generations of enslaved and indentured workers toiled under harsh conditions. Their sweat and labor fueled European markets, building wealth thousands of miles away while leaving local populations impoverished. Historical records indicate that while ports and plantations prospered under imperial administration, the majority of local communities remained economically marginalized, struggling with limited access to land, education, or political voice. The British Empire's infrastructure often mirrored the inequities it propagated, serving profit and control rather than social upliftment. In Africa, the imposition of racial hierarchies reinforced these inequalities. European settlers were granted the best lands, while indigenous populations were relegated to laboring on marginal plots or forced into migrant work systems. The introduction of cash crops such as cocoa, coffee, and cotton reshaped local economies, but often prioritized export over community sustenance. Economic policies were designed to benefit the imperial center, creating dependencies that persisted long after the end of formal colonial rule. Local communities faced dispossession and the erasure of traditional land rights, a pattern repeated across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Stories of individuals illustrate these systemic inequalities vividly. A Kenyan farmer in the 1930s, for example, recounts how his family was relocated to make way for a settler farm. Forced to work for meager wages on land they once owned, his community experienced the stark contrast between colonial promises of development and the harsh reality of exploitation. Similarly, in Malaya, rubber plantation workers endured grueling conditions while the wealth generated flowed to foreign investors and colonial administrators. These lived experiences reveal the human dimension of economic and social inequities under imperial rule. Yet the empire also left infrastructure that benefited certain regions, creating a paradox of progress and oppression. Schools, hospitals, and legal systems were established, but access often depended on race, class, or proximity to urban centers. While some communities could leverage these institutions for advancement, many others remained excluded, highlighting the unequal distribution of imperial resources. The story of development is thus inseparable from the story of exclusion, where the benefits of colonial rule were never evenly shared. Curiosity arises when we consider why such inequalities persisted despite the apparent modernization brought by empire. Scholars argue that economic exploitation, social hierarchies, and political structures were intertwined, deliberately reinforcing British dominance. The human cost, however, was profound and enduring. Entire generations faced restricted mobility, diminished access to education, and limited economic opportunity, while colonial wealth flowed outward. The lingering effects of these disparities continue to influence social and economic conditions in former colonies today. In examining ports, railways, and financial institutions, one sees the duality of empire, symbols of connectivity and modernization, yet also instruments of control and inequity. Trade networks enabled global commerce, yet the labor and resources underpinning them were unevenly distributed. Cities like Nairobi, Mumbai, and Kingston grew under colonial administration, but the prosperity was concentrated among select groups. The empire's legacies are thus deeply layered: progress and exploitation, innovation and dispossession, intertwined across continents and generations. Even the cultural and legal systems reflect this complexity. English language education, administrative practices, and governance models offered pathways to opportunity, but often served to perpetuate existing hierarchies. Local elites could sometimes ascend through these structures, yet the majority remained marginalized. The human stories of resilience, adaptation, and survival are essential to understanding the uneven impact of British rule. As we trace the human stories across continents, we see the diversity and adaptability of Commonwealth connections. From Caribbean cricketers competing in England to African leaders negotiating climate initiatives in London, from Indian filmmakers collaborating with Canadian studios to education partnerships across the Pacific, the Commonwealth functions as a living legacy. It illustrates how historical structures, once instruments of domination, have been repurposed into networks of mutual engagement, fostering cultural, economic, and diplomatic collaboration. And so, the story of Commonwealth continuity unfolds gently, without finality but with a clear trajectory. It reflects the choices, adaptations, and creativity of nations navigating a shared past while forging distinct futures. The links remain, subtle yet persistent, a testament to the endurance of history, shaping connections that continue to evolve. The narrative concludes softly here, signaling the end of this chapter while keeping the threads of the story alive for the broader tapestry of empire's legacy. The sun sets over the jagged skyline of modern cities, where glass towers reflect centuries-old empires, their shadows stretching far beyond their time. Borders drawn decades, even centuries ago, still shape nations, influence politics, and dictate alliances. The British Empire, once a colossal force spanning continents, may have receded, yet its fingerprints remain embedded in the world's geography, diplomacy, and global power structures. From the cobbled streets of London to the bustling markets of Mumbai, the legacies of imperial ambition quietly, persistently guide the rhythms of modern life. Imagine standing on the cliff edge in Hong Kong, watching the container ships maneuver through the harbor, a harbor built by British engineers to serve empire trade routes. These same routes now power global commerce, connecting economies thousands of miles apart. A historian might point to maps of colonial boundaries, explaining how decisions made in imperial boardrooms continue to affect ethnic divisions, regional conflicts, and international diplomacy. The real-life stories of displaced communities, of nations navigating inherited borders, reveal the human consequences of these enduring structures. During the 20th century, as empires crumbled and nations gained independence, new political landscapes emerged. Some inherited legal frameworks, bureaucracies, and governance systems that remain remarkably influential. For instance, India's parliamentary system, Kenya's legal codes, and Australia's federal structures echo the British model. Yet, behind these familiar institutions lie stories of negotiation, adaptation, and resistance. Communities learn to operate within frameworks once imposed upon them, turning tools of control into instruments of their own progress, illustrating the intricate interplay between legacy and agency. Curiosity lingers when one considers the subtle ways imperial patterns persist. Economic dependencies, trade agreements, and international alliances often mirror historical alignments. The Commonwealth, the United Nations, and even bilateral trade partnerships reflect networks first forged under empire. Consider the African nations that continue to trade heavily with the United Kingdom, or former colonies that adopted English as a lingua franca for governance, commerce, and education. Each connection carries a story of survival, adaptation, and continuity, an echo of imperial strategy reshaped by time and necessity. Storytelling brings this influence to life. A diplomat from Canada negotiates a trade agreement with Singapore, navigating legal norms rooted in British law. A young entrepreneur in Ghana benefits from international trade routes established during colonial times, exporting cocoa to London. Their experiences reveal how imperial legacies function invisibly, shaping opportunities while reminding us of past inequalities. The interplay of power, culture, and historical structures continues to affect decision-making in boardrooms, classrooms, and government offices worldwide. Historical data underscores the magnitude of these legacies. Maps of colonial boundaries explain modern territorial disputes, while trade statistics reveal the enduring economic patterns set centuries ago. The Suez Canal, Hong Kong's port, the Caribbean sugar plantations, all stand as markers of imperial influence, continuously reshaped in contemporary contexts. Scientific studies on economic dependency show that former colonies often remain linked to previous imperial powers, not through coercion, but through historical infrastructure, language, and institutional continuity. Explanation deepens our understanding. The empire's reach was not only territorial but structural, embedding systems that persist long after political control ended. Diplomacy, trade, education, and legal norms all carry forward practices established to manage vast and diverse territories. Today, these systems offer both opportunities and challenges, reflecting a world still navigating the complex consequences of past power. The influence is enduring because it is embedded, subtle, and interwoven with local adaptation, creating patterns that survive without overt coercion. Visualize the global stage. The United Nations Assembly with representatives from dozens of countries, some of which once answered to the same imperial crown. International law, diplomatic protocols, and even sports organizations carry the invisible imprint of history. The narrative of influence stretches across oceans and generations, connecting decisions made in the 19th century to present-day international relations. Each gesture, each treaty, each negotiation bears a whisper of the empire that once spanned the globe. As the camera pans from the bustling streets of Lagos to the boardrooms of London, from the classrooms of New Delhi to the ports of Sydney, the story of enduring global influence comes into focus. It is not merely a tale of power lost or gained, but of structures that persist, transformed by time and human agency. The complex interplay of history, resistance, adaptation, and legacy continues to shape geopolitics, borders, and global relations, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in systems, relationships, and institutions. And so, the story of the British Empire's enduring influence concludes softly, like the last notes of a symphony fading into memory. The chapters of expansion, exploitation, governance, resistance, and legacy have been explored, revealing a web of connections that continue to shape our modern world. The narrative ends here, yet the threads remain, carrying the echoes of history into every corner of the globe, leaving viewers with a sense of continuity, reflection, and curiosity about the forces that shape nations and human lives.